There we go. Hello, hello. We are 1 minute late, but you get 1 minute lateness when you got two special guests. I mean, I think you can accept 60 seconds when we have two big time guests, first guests of season 2 of the Hoop Talk podcast. We do have Logan and Carsten from Nerd Sesh. If you guys want to introduce yourself, I think the people know you, but just in case they don't and they've been living under a rock, what is Nerd Sesh and who are you guys?
Yeah, very excited to be here. Excited to talk some basketball with you guys. So we do a lot of NBA stuff. We also talk some NFL. We're not going to mention that today with Marz. He got very upset already at an American football reference before we started recording. But and we do a lot of trivia stuff too. So we really love the history side of it. So we're everywhere. We're YouTube. We're TikTok. Wherever you get your stuff.
Yeah, I seen the thing that turned me onto you guys is you might know the most random trivia I've ever seen in my life.
It's a sickness.
The stuff I be seeing is ridiculous. I pride myself on knowing a little thing here and there, but when you know who was averaging 8 points a game on the St. Louis Hawks in 1958, I just gotta tip my hat. I don't know, but shout out to you. That's great content. I've been keeping up for a little while, just seeing what I see. Definitely like the way you guys talk about the game. I think we're in for a great show today. That's the plan. We want to provide great content. But today, for anyone looking at the title, just wondering what it is, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But we are going to be discussing the best NBA peaks of the last 25 years or so. So going back to the 2000 season to today, who have been the best players peak-wise in that time frame. But I think before we even get into our lists or whatever we have right now, I want to get common ground on what a peak is. Some people view it as one season. Some people view it as 3 seasons. Some people view a prime as a peak. So I'm going to start with what I view peak as, and then we're going to go one by one to make sure that we're all somewhere in the same ballpark or we know what each other are discussing. So for me, peak has to be multiple seasons. I think single season peaks leave some room for outlier shooting seasons, outlier production. The example I always go to is Julius Randle shot 40% from 3 in 2021. He is not a 40% three-point shooter. I believe Mike James in the mid-2000s had a season averaging 20 points per game. He is not a 20-point per game scorer. So I think in order to avoid as many outlier production or outlier shooting seasons, anything else, you want to try and extend the baseline from at least multiple seasons. I try to go at least 3, but I do think if you do have an outlier peak, that I can maybe be willing to negotiate to 2 seasons for some certain players. Also, ideally, I want to have 3 straight years. I like consecutive years. I don't like having years where you miss a year or 2 due to injuries. But once again, if there are some exceptional circumstances, like maybe a Kawhi Leonard, I'm willing to overlook that. Like, for example, 17, 18, and 19, he was hurt in 18, but I am willing to overlook that for certain level of players. But overall, just how good you were, multiple season stretch, overall impact. It's not I value defense and offense 50-50. It depends on the player, it depends on the era, it depends on different constraints based on the game. But overall, that's the most basic way I can explain what I define a peak as. John, do you have anything you would want to add in terms of what a peak is for you?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's just 2 to 3, maybe 4 seasons of someone playing at their highest level in their career, whether it's they hit their peak athletically, defensively, offensively. They're playing the best ball they've played in their career, and they have been able to sustain it for a 2 to 3 season mark. So when we look at players and we see that, oh, this guy is an MVP in this season, or this guy was offensively gifted or defensively gifted in this season, he was able to sustain that at the highest level for 3 seasons. I would look at that as a peak.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add, I think you did a good job summarizing it, Marz. The only thing I would add is that I value playoffs over regular season. That would be the only little asterisk I add, is that, if you crap your pants on the biggest stage, I'm probably going to devalue your peak a little bit more than if you had, a bad regular season stretch. So that's the only caveat I'd add. But yeah, I look at it 3 to 4 years. How great were you at your peak? But I think you did a good job summarizing it.
Thank you.
I agree with basically everything you guys have laid out. Yeah, I like how you said that, Marz. I agree. I'm inclined not to just define one season as a peak, especially if you do see a substantial difference between that year and the other years surrounding it. So I think 2 years for me is enough to be sold that that's the level that player was at. But I agree with the multiple year peak.
Okay, so it looks like we're all in similar standing, so there shouldn't be too much. I'm not saying shouldn't be too much variety, but at least we're all talking from the same from the same book. We're reading from the same hymn sheet, which is good. It's hard to do this when you don't know where to start. So I think the easiest place to start is with someone who I know everyone views as a really high peak. And that is LeBron James. I want to start talking about LeBron James. And I think the hardest thing when it comes down to LeBron James is, when did you guys decide his peak actually was? Because I've gone back and forth on when LeBron James' peak is. For me, there's like 3 answers that you could really go to. And I don't know what to do with LeBron. So I want to defer to you guys. I'm gonna start with Logan. I'm gonna put the pressure on you. When was LeBron James's peak to you?
Well, I think it's interesting that you highlight that it could be different eras. I mean, this is obviously ridiculous. Just because of how far he's dropped athletically, but like even last year, LeBron was one of the best players on the planet. Like the ridiculous stat that was going around was, I think he was the only player in NBA history to shoot 40% from deep and over 70% at the rim ever. That's in all of NBA history, and that's year like 21 or 20 LeBron, which is ridiculous. But I think his peak was 2016 to 2018, and I think when we're looking at, I think it's some of the greatest basketball ever played by a single player. I think the 2016 finals is probably the greatest finals ever played, and just the defining moment, in my opinion, of LeBron's career. I think when you're looking at how athletic he still was, the control of the game in the half court, his ability to put pressure on the rim, and that's the difference. And that's why I'd say it was that era, because he's still really, really athletic, but this LeBron was smarter than he had ever been before. And I just think he had a different level of control of the game, where every single possession in the half court, he's dictating, right? If he's driving down the lane, if he's getting set up in pick and rolls and stuff like that. LeBron can't do that anymore. And I think in Miami, his role was a little bit different. This is the LeBron where I just think he had the most control of the game and was still at the peak of his powers athletically. And again, I think it's his biggest moment. Right. When I think of LeBron's career, I think of him breaking down in tears after that Game 7. Cleveland, we did it for you. I think that's the pinnacle, the block on Iguodala. And unfortunately, that game erased a Draymond Green masterpiece. I'm not going to get into that, but it did. That's an all-time game. I would hear an argument for Miami LeBron, like that Cleveland to Miami era, because obviously he wins all his MVP awards in that early stretch. But 2016 to 2018, I think, is when LeBron was at the peak of his powers, just intellectually. I think he still had it athletically and could still score the ball. And he's the greatest rim pressure, I think, of all time. So in the last 25 years, I think it's no question that LeBron's number one all time. I still think I'd have MJ above him. I know we're not doing that. I'd have MJ's peak above LeBron, but I'm like Carson. I don't know if you guys saw his video too. I was an MJ truther for a very long time. I do think LeBron's the GOAT now. I think his longevity.
Oh, damn. Okay, we got GOAT takes. Okay.
Not to
stay on topic, Logan.
Yeah, my fault. The last 25 years, I think it's unquestionably LeBron, and I think 2016 to 2018 was his apex.
I know Carson did name LeBron as his GOAT recently, but I am curious, do you agree with your co-host of 2016 to 18 being LeBron's peak?
I don't. I actually just made a video on this a few days ago, ironically, because I think it's a super interesting debate. And I think that there are several different points that people look at with LeBron. There are people who will look at the 2009-2010 range and say, that's the greatest regular season floor raiser we've seen, getting those Cleveland teams to win in the mid-60s when they had really pretty average talent around him, and he was just athletically, in terms of explosiveness, at his absolute best. And then there are people who argue 2016-18, like Logan, which I do think was absolutely his offensive peak. 2017 and 2018 are the two best offensive postseasons of LeBron's career, in my opinion. The control of the game was at its most masterful. His bully ball was just the most polished. So I can see that case. For me, though, I really think 2016 is pretty clearly the best version of LeBron you get in those 3 years. And the reason for that is he was so much better defensively in that playoff run than he was, especially in 2018 when he was really a very average defensive player. So for me, LeBron's peak is 2013 and 2014, because I think that's actually when he's at his overall athletic peak. I mentioned his explosiveness peak was that 2009-2010 range, but 2013, 2014, he still had 95% of that explosiveness. And he was significantly stronger. That made him a more versatile defensive player, right? You could see that he could switch on to fives for stretches. And that was just the smartest he ever was defensively. As a help defender, he was smarter, more mature at that point. I think it was the best off-ball LeBron that we ever got. Incredibly explosive as a cutter. It was the best 3-point shooting LeBron that we got up until this current version over the last 2 years. It was the most efficient LeBron overall. He's up at like 64, 65% true shooting. So just in terms of being dominant in every facet of the game, and in terms of being the ultimate ceiling raiser, which to me is a little more valuable than floor raising, because my goal is to win titles. And I don't think that there's ever been a version of LeBron who you more seamlessly could have plugged into any different situation, and he would make an A+ impact in every facet of the game than 2013, 2014 LeBron. So I hear the case for 2016 to 2018, but I think as an all-around two-way, hyper-versatile, hyper-efficient basketball player, 2013, 2014 was the peak.
Do you also think that, I mean, I know people might be mad in terms of content creation that we're spoiling this 11 minutes in, but do we also think that LeBron is the best peak of the last 25 years?
I don't think it's close.
I think they came into this video knowing.
Yeah.
And I mean, some people,
bias.
maybe I might be the one to play devil's advocate and make an argument for a certain someone who peaks in the early 2000s. We don't know. Maybe. I don't know.
You have a track record.
I have a way with words. I think I can make a convincing case. I'm gonna be honest. I think I could. But before I do, I think that might be the player we talk about next, if I'm being honest. But we've got two different answers so far. We've got 13, 14, and we've got 16 through 18. John, you could be a tiebreaker, or you could go against the grain here. When do you think LeBron's peak is?
I'm going to be the tiebreaker, and I'm going to go 13, 14 as well. And some of the rim pressure that LeBron James was able to create in those seasons, whether it's his change of pace or just being able to be such a gifted finisher, whether it's on stronger defenders, whether it's on taller defenders. And then this is like Carson said, that he was one of the better shooters, or he had one of his better shooting seasons since his Lakers season. You add that on top of fantastic transition play, whether he was able to play passing lanes, be a rim protector. He really improved his post game throughout those seasons. I know he was getting exposed against the Mavericks for having a bad post game. So when you add all that together, and now he's extremely athletic, probably his athletic peak throughout his entire season or throughout his entire career, I would say that 13-14 was LeBron's peak.
Oh, damn. I'm inclined to agree with you guys, but I feel I'm doing a disservice to LeBron if I don't at least give a major credit to 2009, 2010 LeBron. Yeah. That for me is the most impressive LeBron, I think. And when you talk about like Carson said, with the floor raising ability, but the explosiveness, I understand. I think you can make the case that 2013 LeBron was more overall athletic because of the added strength, which I think was important, and that allowed him to become, I think, what was a better finisher. But the pure baseline to baseline speed that LeBron had in 2009, the ability to get to the rim whenever he wanted, the first step is unlike anything I've ever seen from a specimen that big. I've never seen someone go from the three-point line to the paint in one dribble that fast. It's ridiculous. That pressure that put on defenses, when you look at how teams like Boston or Orlando would load up to him, people hold it against him that the jump shot wasn't consistent. And I can understand that hesitation, but I would make the case that even in 2013, LeBron's jump shot wasn't consistent. A big thing that people talk about, I'm not one for the Ray Allen save LeBron James legacy, but what I do think is important is that a big reason why LeBron used to struggle against the Spurs is because they would make him a jump shooter. And even in 2013, the first 4 or 5 games of that series, he struggled as a jump shooter. Now, it turned around immensely, and that game 7 was amazing. But if Ray Allen doesn't make that shot, we don't see that game 7 where he rains down a bunch of jumpers, and maybe he doesn't get given the credit for doing so. So I think when you look at LeBron in totality, I do think there's a strong case for 3 different subsections of his career as his peak: 09, 10, 12 to 14, and then 16 through 18. And then even if you wanted to be really biased, maybe you could try sneaking a 2020 there, maybe. But me personally, those would be my 3 choices. If I were to rank them 1 through 3, I would go 12, 14, 16, 18, and then 09, 10, just because I think the best of LeBron offensively was that second stint in Cleveland. Me personally, if I had to pick my favorite year of those 3, especially offensively, it would be 2017. I think the jump shot was all the way dialed in. The mastery of half-court offense was better than maybe anyone we've probably ever seen, other than maybe one other person we might talk about later today. But just being able to abuse opponents from all over the floor, bullying people in the post of mismatches, commands in pick and rolls, even being used as a screener in certain instances. There was nothing LeBron couldn't do. And I think that was an overall mastery of offense that not many people can match. But I think what gets understated is how good LeBron James was defensively, not just from a versatility standpoint, But the idea that the Heat never had a typical rim protector. Chris Bosh was a switchable big. He was a smaller 5 who was able to step out on the perimeter. But LeBron James being able to play backline help, being able to be that rim protector, being able to cover as much ground as he was able to cover, made that Miami Heat defense as dangerous as it was. And I actually compare it in some ways to the current Oklahoma City Thunder in the ways that they would force turnovers relentlessly. And a big part of that was because of LeBron on the back line. He was just so relentless being able to cover all that ground that I think Miami led the league in forced turnovers every year he was there, when LeBron's a big part of that. And obviously that transition offense was a big reason why they were so successful. So I said all of that to basically say, Miami LeBron is the best LeBron, I think. And spoiler alert, I do think he is the best player of the last 25 years. So we started off all in agreement, which I think is a good place to start. So we all think LeBron is the best player of the last 25 years. And although Logan was the only one who went with second stint Cleveland LeBron, I think we would all agree that LeBron probably has 2 or maybe even 3 stints that would be number 1 on this list. So let's just say we got the elephant out of the room really quickly. So I want to go from LeBron to someone who maybe doesn't get put into these conversations, and maybe he doesn't deserve to, but he is LeBron James' teammate, Dwyane Wade. Does Dwyane Wade get any consideration for you guys? Because I know he does for me, but I wanna give you guys the floor. So I'm gonna start with John D. Did you consider Dwyane Wade at all? And why not?
Did I consider Dwyane Wade? I would consider him in this list, but I do think there is a certain level of offense that a lot of these guys on this list were able to obtain that maybe D Wade just has not been able to do, maybe as long or at the higher levels of a guy like Steph, KD. Not to spoil the list, but I don't think he was up there offensively. Now, defensively, I could make the argument that D Wade did bring some defensive talent that some of these guys did not. But to have him up on this list or towards the top of this list, I didn't consider him.
Yeah, I disagree.
D Wade's a really good shout, man. I mean, I think people, when they think about those teams, or the team specifically in 2006 that won the title over Dallas, he had Shaq and he had Antoine Walker. Antoine Walker was the second leading scorer for Miami in that NBA Finals. And I think that kind of gets lost in the mud. It's like, he had Shaq. Shaq was washed at that point. You know what I mean? Shaq was on net. He's been in the buffet line gaining weight, getting shipped around from team to team. Like Shaq was, way on his way down, and D Wade carried them through. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'm pretty sure he averaged 35 points per game in that series. And when we're talking about the greatest rim pressuring and defensive playmaking guards, I think D Wade is among the greatest of all time. I mean, D Wade, Flash could just get to the cup with such ease, and he was a really good mid-range jump shooter. Obviously, right, he didn't have the floor spacing, and I do agree with John. I think he made a good point about the length of his peak, and I know we're just talking about absolute apexes here, so that that doesn't necessarily factor into our arguments here. But he gets injured, and by like 2012, 2013, that's D Wade. That's just not anywhere close to his apex. But D Wade from 06 to 09 was one of the best guards in the league. And if somebody wanted to make an argument for Dwyane Wade being here, I would hear it. But I do think there are some better offensive engines. There are some guys that I would rather prefer as my offensive number 1. But wholeheartedly, if you had D Wade in your top 10, I wouldn't argue against it. He's a really good candidate and a really good shout. To spoil it though, I do not have D Wade on my list.
I'm hoping Carson saves me here, because maybe I'm the only one who really putting the respect on Dwyane Wade's name I think he deserves. So Carson, please bail me out here. I need someone to be on my side of this.
I love D Wade. I mean, how high are we talking? Are we talking top 10 this century?
In and around the conversation. That's what I'm trying to. In and around the conversation.
Yeah, I would have him in the conversation, but I didn't have him stamped in my top 10.
He's certainly in the conversation. Okay. I think he would probably be the first dude out of my top 10, and that is largely just a testament to how insanely talented the league has been for the last 25 years. But what's really interesting with D Wade is I think that he does have like a legitimate half-decade peak, and then obviously the fall off is pretty precipitous. But 2006, you would say, is his best postseason run, but I think 2009, 2010 is probably when he really peaked as a basketball player. And he wasn't like quite the absolute insane downhill freak who could draw 15 free throws a night in the finals like he did in 2006, but he was still one of the best downhill guards that we've ever seen. And he was a significantly better playmaker. He was a good playmaker in 2006, but I think you look at what he did in 2009, that was a really impressive floor raising job. There's just some other dudes who were able to reach more elite heights in terms of their efficiency, their ease as a scorer, or although D-Wade was a very good defensive guard, one of the two best shot blocking guards we've seen, dudes who were more dominant two-way forces. Like, I think him versus a Kawhi Leonard is a very interesting sort of comparison. I would lean on the side of Kawhi there as the bigger, more impactful defender, more efficient scorer. But those are two dudes who both had like these supernova individual runs where they willed these teams to titles. So D-Wade is absolutely in the mix, but he's not like somebody you can make a top 5 case for this century. I definitely don't think.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say top 5, and I'm being honest, I'm going to be improvising any top 10 I do have. It's going to be straight off the dome with this.
Yeah.
But I want to start off by saying I don't consider 06 to be a part of Dwyane Wade's peak. Now, I understand the finals performance and the finals run, and even in 05, I think if Dwyane Wade doesn't get hurt, they probably go to the finals that year as well. No disrespect to the Pistons. But for me, I think Dwyane Wade did level up majorly by 2009. So if I were to say what Dwyane Wade's peak is, I would probably say 2009, 2010, maybe throw in 2011 in there as well, because I think he was actually really, really good that year. And then there was quite a big fall off from that point onwards. I think that hip injury in the 2011 finals didn't help him. But I think for me with Dwyane Wade, what made me so adamant that he's at least around this conversation is just, I think his downhill threat, his ability to play in pick and roll was so special, especially in that era, that I think he was one of the elite offensive players in the game at that time. I've never seen someone be able to split screens or reject screens as well as he does and get downhill and get to the rim. I think his passing and playmaking is historically underrated. I think he saw the floor really well. His ability to actually like make those reads in terms of finding guys, interior passes, laydowns, even some lobs was really good. And even though he wasn't a floor spacer, his ability to understand that he was the guy teams would help off of and being able to make those baseline cuts and being able to crush the offensive glass when people do leave him did provide some de facto spacing in the non-typical sense, but I do think it did provide some value, especially in the off-ball sense. I think the hesitation I guess I would have with Dwyane Wade would be his fit next to other superstars, and then you do point to the LeBron James Heatles fit where they were pretty much always better when LeBron was on the floor without D-Wade, just because it was a bit clunky there and you'd rather have the ball in LeBron's hands. So I do think that kind of hurts him a little bit, but I wouldn't say in so much as to say, like John said, he didn't really consider him. Me personally, I think Dwyane Wade has to be a consideration. Now, does he fall at 12 or 9 or 10? I don't know. But I do think he has to be a consideration and a very tough cut if he doesn't make the list at all. But hearing about Dwyane Wade and how apparently I'm the only one who thinks he's good at basketball, who had the better peak, Dwyane Wade or James Harden? I think that's going to be an important question. I'm curious to know everyone's thoughts on that. I'm going to start with Carson. Who had the better peak, James Harden or Dwyane Wade?
I feel pretty strongly that it was D-Wade, and I think that Harden is one of the greatest regular season offensive engines that we've ever seen, like truly a one-of-a-kind isolation scorer. And if you look at what he did with Houston, I mean, all the way from like 2016 to 2020, it's really, really remarkable. But I do think that D-Wade was clearly a significantly more impactful defensive player, and I also just really prefer his offensive style in the playoffs. Now, I agree with you in that neither of these guys are easy fits alongside other stars, right? With Harden, it's just a lack of willingness to play off ball. With D-Wade, it's a lack of catch and shoot ability that can make him a little difficult to scale alongside other more ball dominant players. But D-Wade just had that ability to will his way to the rim that you can't take away, especially when you pair that with the intermediate shot making that he had, where he was like 46% from floater range. That's a phenomenal number throughout his prime. And he had the mid-range counter, and then his playmaking was a real strength, as you mentioned. Whereas Harden, we did see, although his playoff numbers are still very impressive by his standards, there's clear regression in terms of volume and efficiency. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. I think the fact that he was reliant on foul grifting to an extent, but to a noticeable enough point where you're going to drop off by a couple free throw attempts per night, that's a factor in his playoff decline. I also just think the lack of variety in terms of shot making, right? I think that when you are facing a team in a 7-game series, it becomes easier to guard a player who is hunting only the most high value shots, if that's a step back three or if that's a shot at the rim, than it is when you're just seeing him on a Tuesday night in November and he's one of the best offensive players ever. And then also, Harden's 3-point shot did let him down in the playoffs. And I think part of that is fatigue. I think part of that is the predictability as well, but that was just sort of inherent to his play style. I don't like how Harden's play style scaled to the playoffs, whereas I think that D Wade as a number one showed you what he could do in 2006, which I would agree, Marz, wasn't even his absolute peak as a player, which I would say is 2009, 2010.
John, James Harden or Dwyane Wade?
I'm gonna go D Wade, and I think Carson made a very good point. Is when we go to the playoffs, I think one of the best ways to generate offense is to get constant pressure on the rim. That opens up a lot of things for offenses. And the way James Harden played, it was very reliant on his 3-point shot. It was very reliant on getting to the rim. So when we get to the playoffs and we see James Harden not get those free throw calls because now guys are playing a lot more physical, you can kind of bank on Dwyane Wade getting to the rim, whether it's in the pick and roll, whether it's in transition, whether it's cutting to the basket. And then defensively, he was so much better than Harden, in my opinion. It would make me think or make me lean more D Wade, just because the athleticism was there, the transition play was there, and he was constantly doing what he was best at. And with Harden, there's multiple nights where sometimes the shot isn't falling when you have such a tough shot diet on 3-pointers and in the pick and roll, where D Wade is constantly putting pressure on the basket and opening up better opportunities for his players around him, whether it's open corner threes or other guys cutting to the basket or being able to draw 2 defenders when he's within 3 feet. I would lean D Wade.
Yeah, and it sucks because that play style is inherently just, going to lead you to struggle later in the playoffs, right? When you have the ball in your hands that much, you're just going to be naturally tired at the end of games. It's going to be hard for you to keep up that kind of workload. And, we are results-oriented based, right? Traditionally, when we're thinking about sports, I do think that if Harden, I think that 2018 Rockets team is one of the greatest teams of this century to not win a title, considering what him and Chris Paul were doing. I wonder, and again, this is hypothetical, so do with this what you will, but when we look through that prism, it's like if that 2018 Rockets team doesn't go ice cold in the playoffs, if they get it done, how differently do we look at James Harden and his career at the end of the day? But I agree. I think you guys made some great points. It's his playoff shortcomings that keeps him from off this list, the lack of defense, the turnovers, him just falling short, but I always wonder if 2018 had gone differently, if the Rockets win that title, if we look at James Harden in a completely different light. But I have an immense amount of respect for him and what he was as a regular season offensive engine.
Feels like I'm just by myself, isolated every time I bring up a player. I think I'm not willing. I can accept Dwyane Wade being the better peak. I'm not mad at that at all. I do think James Harden gets incorrectly maligned for his play style. I can understand the inherent flaws that come with it, but I do think he came as close to succeeding within it as anyone probably could have hoped for. And things didn't go his way, and obviously in order to win you need some luck on your side. But I don't think inherently his shot diet was a problem, in so much as I think the Rockets, and I'm talking about Chris Paul here, losing the player they had who could get to that shot was a problem. I think an offense needs mid-range shot creation and someone who can just play in between. But I don't think they required James Harden to do so, as they built their roster where they had Chris Paul who could do it. So then when he went missing, now it becomes a bigger problem. But I don't think that's really James Harden's fault, as I think it was just a product of the guy they had who was able to fill that role wasn't there anymore. It's kind of like, and I don't want to spoil my opinions on Steph Curry too much, but it's kind of like when Steph Curry struggled a bit as an isolation player and they acquired Kevin Durant. And then if now Kevin Durant disappears and now we're like, oh, well, you can't win playing like Steph Curry because he doesn't create an isolation. Like, I wouldn't agree with that, as I would just say that everything else he brings, you would just need to build a roster correctly. And I think they did build the roster correctly. Chris Paul just got hurt. But you have a challenge.
Yeah, well, I do have a bit of a challenge. I think that there were some shortcomings that we saw with Harden repeatedly, where I think some people now are rewriting it to say, well, Harden actually wasn't somebody who dropped it all in the playoffs. And like, well, he posed the best challenge to the KD Steph Warriors, and they're the only reason that he didn't win a title or maybe even 2 titles. He's 28% from deep in the 2017 playoffs. He's under 30% in the 2018 playoffs. Like, that is specifically on him. That is something that he made a tenet of his game that he did not have the ability to go away from. I absolutely do think that that's on the individual player. And the thing with Steph, I don't think that those are comparable criticisms at all, because Steph is an elite isolation scorer. He doesn't do it on super high volume, but I mean, we've seen those numbers year after year after year. And also, he's won multiple titles now without Kevin Durant, led tons of great offenses. And also, it's just the reality throughout NBA history, something we've seen over and over again, that when you bring off-ball value like Steph does, and Steph is one of a kind, but just when you are a versatile player who can play on and off the ball, who can hunt your shot from various places on the floor, who has a super reliable intermediate game, like, that's not an anti-James Harden thing. James Harden is just the dude who epitomized neglecting those parts of his game. But we've seen over and over again the dudes who, again, do all the things that I just mentioned, play away from the ball, can score from all three levels. Those are the guys who scale better to strong talent alongside them. Those are the guys who ultimately are the best ceiling raisers and often the best playoff performers. So that's the thing with Harden. Obviously, he's a great individual offensive talent, and he still was really impressive in the playoffs. But when we're holding him to the standard he set in the regular season or the standard of some of these other great peaks, I think that he has to be accountable for the fact that he fell short, and his play style was absolutely part of that.
I want to clarify. I'm not trying to imply that James Harden didn't drop in the postseason.
Okay, because I hear that.
Yeah.
I do hear Harden defenders say that, and I'm like,
yeah,
I'm
a pretty stark Harden defender, but even I wouldn't try and make that point. He absolutely dropped. Now, my disagreement would be with how much people say he dropped or how much he is directly responsible for his team's shortcomings. Now, 2017, I think, is a year that I would say is on James Harden, but I don't consider 2017 to be part of James Harden's peak. I do think, personally, if I were to pick 3 years, I would go 2019 through 2021. But if I were to pick 4 years, I would include 2018 through 2021. I think that Brooklyn James Harden is one of the most underrated players we've seen in a while, and I do think it's probably because he got hurt in the postseason. But what he was doing that year, what he was doing in round 1 against Boston when he was healthy, was it was playoff translation. If we're going to put it simply, he was translating to postseason. He was playing at an elite level, scoring efficiently, being arguably the best playmaker in the sport at that point. There was nothing he really couldn't do offensively. And to the Steph point, are you of the belief that Steph Curry was an elite isolation player pre-2019? Like, because I think he became that.
Yeah, I think he took a level up, right? I think if you're looking at like 2021, 2022 Steph, when he's stronger, he's a little bit more physically equipped to handle more physical defenders. That's when he peaked as an isolation scorer. But I would say he's been a very good isolation scorer since the beginning of his prime.
I would agree with very good. Yeah. And also to the 3-point, my issue with guys like James Harden, if you don't shoot like Steph Curry, and no one does, and you rely as much on the 3 ball as James Harden did, you are susceptible to variance or teams being able to key in on that. And like you said, when you're shooting 28% from 3 in postseason runs, that's going to affect your efficiency and your effectiveness a lot. So that is my hesitations with James Harden. But just in terms of, I understand he didn't put pressure on the rim like Dwyane Wade, but when you look at his ability to load defenses towards him and collapse defenses from the 3-point line, or the moment he drives, the moment he breaks the paint, he's collapsing defenses. So he doesn't need to get all the way to the rim to open up that lob for Clint Capella or open up that corner 3 for PJ Tucker. So even if he's not relentlessly getting to the paint or getting to the rim, he's still able to make that impact felt in a similar way to the elite rim pressures of NBA history, which I do think is extremely special. And then I feel like at some point I got to mention that James Harden just might be the best isolation player we've ever seen. I do think that's very important, very impressive. The 2019 season, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm pretty sure he isolated 16 times a game. And I'm pretty sure he led the league in isolation efficiency as well.
He scored over 15 points per game just on ISOs that year. And I think like one other person has hit double digits in the history of the recorded stat, and I think it was SGA last year, but he got to like 10 or something. It's insane.
No one's done it like Pete Harden. So I'm fine to concede Dwyane Wade. I'm never going to argue against Dwyane Wade, but I do feel that James Harden, in part because of playoff success, and to Logan's point, I do think if they did win in 2018, he would be viewed very differently, much more favorably. And I do think most people would actually think he's better than Dwyane Wade. I'm not sure I would be one of them, but I do think many people would feel that way. But we have got James Harden out of the way. And before we move on to the next players I had on the agenda, we do have some super chats. So we will get to them. We have Teddy Hart with the $20. Shout out to you, Teddy. He said Marz and Nerd Sesh and John D. Respect John D. Are the collab I never thought I'd see. This is awesome. For your life, who would you pick in a one-on-one, prime Tmac or Carmelo, and why? I always find these questions interesting, but John D, since he disrespected you, I want you to answer this one first. Prime Tmac or Melo in a one-on-one?
I'm gonna take Melo.
Oh my God, you picked the wrong answer. Jesus. Okay.
I'm gonna take Melo. I'm gonna take Melo, man. I think his physicality, his strength, the way he would be able to get to the rim and then finish in the mid-range, in the post, whether it's pull-up mid-ranges, I think I would take Melo.
Logan?
I'm taking T-Mac. I mean, I guess we're doing make it, take it. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, Melo's probably, I mean, he's like at the pinnacle there, but I would just trust T-Mac to get a few more stops than Melo. I don't think Melo's stopping anything, but 1v1's tough, man. But I'd take T-Mac.
Okay, let me ask a question here, because we're talking about how this episode we're counting multiple year peaks as peaks. I think that's important with T-Mac because T-Mac's 03 season, incredible. One of the great scoring seasons we've seen. But the big difference that year between every other year is he was a high volume, really, really good three-point shooter. He was like 38%,
I think. Yeah, it was...
right. And he never replicated those numbers, and he never replicated those overall efficiency scoring numbers. So if I get 03 T-Mac, I'll take him. But any other version of T-Mac, it's tough because I actually do like John's point. I mean, if we're just visualizing a game of ones, Melo is so much stronger and he's so capable of getting to that mid-post area. And I guess if we're counting ones and twos, those aren't the most valuable shots. A pull-up three is more valuable if we're going, traditional ones rules. But I do think that T-Mac at his absolute best was the better scorer. He was also a much better playmaker, but that doesn't matter in this. I'll go T-Mac, but I actually think it's very close.
I also think it's very close. I'm just a T-Mac advocate. I do think I think it depends. I mean, if you're just playing top of the key, I think T-Mac's probably got it. I think Melo has the better first step, but I do think T-Mac has more counters to get downhill and get to the rim.
Which version of Melo are you taking for this game? Because I'm thinking like 2013 Melo, just because I think he was such a post-up power.
Oh, you're taking slower Melo. Okay.
I'm taking slower Melo because I think the post game was just so damn good, and he was a better jump shooter at that point. Much better jump shooter.
I was thinking, let me get fast as hell Melo just so I could.
Yeah.
I mean, that you can't really go wrong. I was thinking maybe 07, 08, 09 Melo, but I can see a 2012, 2013 Melo. I think that changes the game. If I'm being honest, I do think which Melo it is that changes the game. Either way, I'm picking T-Mac, but that's coming straight from bias. I do think T-Mac was the better jump shooter. 03 T-Mac. I do think he was able to get to the rim with more ease. And I know the playmaking technically doesn't matter, but if in doubt, I can just throw that off the backboard to myself. And I see T-Mac do that.
T-Mac was butter from the post too, man. He was. If they get you with that jab, like him and Melo both just had so many counters, man. If they got you to bite on that jab, it's over.
I would pay to see that one-on-one. Long story short, that's where I'm at with it. Whoever wins, I wouldn't be mad. I'm rooting for T-Mac, but it would be a great one-on-one game to watch. Few more super chats. One here from DSG Piccolo. He said, "Dub Hoop Talk Pod, appreciate it. Can't stay long. I have to go to my high school reunion. Yes, I'm that old. No judgment here. Miami Bron is my favorite version of him. Once Wade, quote unquote, taught him how to win." Yeah, my favorite version of LeBron has always been first in Cleveland, but I'm also, people have been mad at me for saying I don't particularly enjoy watching LeBron anyway. So, yeah, just not my style. Personally, not my style.
Interesting. What about
very, 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 very good? It's just not for me personally. So,
interesting.
There's that.
I think 2016 Bron would be my favorite to watch.
I was watching that finals as a Warriors fan.
Me too, bro.
Me too, buddy.
Oh damn, I'm alone.
I'm from the Bay, dude. I was broken. That was like the worst sports loss of my life.
I'm just a bandwagon, so it probably didn't hurt me as much. But...
Sorry, not to bring football back up. Carson, you would put that over the Bills' loss last year. I mean, I don't know.
No,
if it gets
honestly,
that,
listen, we're not allowed to talk about this, but I would actually say probably that and the 13-second loss hurt me more because I love the Bills more than the Warriors. But at that
I know
time,
about the Bills is Josh Allen. So
yeah, that's all you need to know.
He just got married. Or he just got engaged.
Carson,
I've seen the Spider-Man guy is not happy. That's what I've seen. So
yeah,
that's all I got.
My boy, man, it's crazy.
Shout out to Josh Allen for his engagement, I guess. But anyway, enough about that nonsensical sport. LDN Hoops, London Hoops. Look at Marz, man. Thank you. Doing big things for the allegedly UK space. Yes, we don't know. A Mo Muncy collab would feed families. Question: do you think OKC should trade for an extra point guard to cover for Shai's limited passing / playmaking? That's an interesting question. I think Shai's improved in that department this year, and I don't think it's going to hold them back too much. And B, I think the addition of Isaiah Hartenstein mitigates a lot of that. Being able to play delay 5 out with Isaiah Hartenstein takes away the onus from Shai to be a primary creator, especially when you have the athletes and the cutters that OKC have with the spacing. Isaiah Hartenstein can be that de facto hub. Now, I'm not going to ask him to be Jokic, but I do think he takes away some of that responsibility, where I don't think Shai's playmaking deficiencies are really going to hold back the OKC offense. But if there was a point guard on the market, maybe there's a Dennis Schroeder available, maybe that level of point guard, Lonzo Ball. If they can get Lonzo Ball, I'm all for it. Lonzo, I support. But I wouldn't
100%.
rush into making a trade, although OKC do have the assets where they could give up 19 picks and probably wouldn't feel it. So if they feel that it is something that needs to be addressed, they could do it. But me personally, I don't think they really need to make any drastic changes. They just need to hope Chet gets back healthy. But do any of you guys think OKC need to acquire a point guard?
I don't necessarily think they need to get a point guard. I think Shai brings almost 2 to the ball every time he gets in 1-on-1. We saw last night, even when he's in between 16 feet and the 3-point line, he's bringing a second guy over, and that creates offense for Isaiah Hartenstein, who can also make decisions with the ball, Jalen Williams, who can also make decisions with the ball. So as long as I'm not going to sit here and say he's Trae Young or LaMelo Ball, but he's going to make the right play when he has the ball, when he's able to find the open man off a collapse. I think that does well enough to where he's going to generate a high level of offense when he's on the floor.
Yeah, and you saw it in the playoffs last year too. I mean, they were doing that when they got eliminated, and I thought Shai did a really good job dealing with double teams. And Marz, you bring up Hardenstein. I mean, and John, you bring up some other guys. I think it's damn near the whole roster, like Kason Wallace, Alex Caruso. I trust everybody to make good decisions and play good ball. And right, like you talk about Shai's job is to just create that initial advantage. And once he does that, everybody else can eat. Like, don't get me wrong. Like you said, if somebody comes available, sure. I mean, Oklahoma City doesn't have to give up, any assets. They've got buku assets. So, but I don't necessarily think that's a big need. I don't necessarily think Oklahoma City really has any big glaring needs. Maybe more reliable shooting, but I trust Wiggins and Kason and Isaiah Joe and the boys to shoot better than they did last year. So I honestly don't think OKC has any holes.
I also just don't think you want to move Shai off the ball anymore to try to slide in like more of a true point. I think that they have enough aggregate playmaking, and I think he is, to me, the best one-on-one perimeter scorer that we have in the league today. And I think that he is definitely a good enough playmaker to produce elite offense out of that. And like you said, Logan, I actually don't think SGA got enough credit for the offensive engine that he was as a scorer and playmaker in the Dallas series. I kind of thought that there was a lack of shot making around him. There was a lack of creation around him. J-Dub wasn't the guy he needed to be. Chet couldn't attack mismatches in that series. And there was some stagnation around him. And I think that he is obviously not an elite playmaker, but he is a pretty good one. And he's an unbelievable scorer with the ball in his hands. He's not as good an off-ball player.
So I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but is OKC all of you guys' favorites in the West right now?
Absolutely. Not even close for me.
They were my favorites last year, and then PJ Washington happened. So
for real, but they're a little more grown up. Everybody's a little better this year. Chet's gonna be a weapon when he gets back out there.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful for OKC this year, which is weird, but yeah. Enough of that. Enough of OKC praise. Dub's bestie wanted to pronounce his love for me. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. But we got a couple super chats that now get us back on topic. We have you running 5.7 said Giannis's peak is very underrated. arguably a top 3 player since 2019 and having his best season this year. So I think we can use this to talk about Giannis. Now, I want to ask, first of all, do you guys agree that Giannis is having his best season? And then we can use that to talk about where we think Giannis's peak stacks up to the last 25 years. I'm gonna start with Carson on Giannis.
When we say best season, do we mean just best regular season? Because obviously that's all he has. But if we're looking at a year in totality, I think 2021 is the best Giannis. I think 2021-22 is his peak, because I think that 2022, you saw a playmaking leap from him. And I actually think offensively, he's just continued to get better. But 2021 was the best combination of him being a more mature offensive player, a better playmaker, just absolutely going through the field in that postseason offensively in a way that he certainly hadn't been able to previously, where he had struggled, and still getting that elite defensive impact from Giannis, which I don't think that we've gotten over the last couple of years. I do think that he's regressed there. So I would take 2021 Giannis as his peak. And again, since we're going multiple years, throw 2022 in there as well. And I think that that's an amazingly high peak. I think that for me, that's right outside the top 5 peaks this century.
Wow, right outside the top 5. Okay. Logan, where do you stand on Giannis's peak?
I mean, I'm wondering about him this year. I don't know if he's at the peak of his powers athletically. And like Carson said, when you're talking about totality, I mean, the guy dropped a 50 piece in the finals, right? It's kind of hard to go against that. But this year, I think over the past couple of years, I mean, Giannis has continued to grow better and better as a playmaker, learning how to weaponize his gravity on the inside. And he's like legitimately like good passer. You know, I think people kind of got this view of Giannis when Harden shit on him and was like, you know, he's running dunk man, right? But Giannis has, like, he's a legitimately good passer. And this year, we've seen this a little bit over the past couple of years. Dude, the shot, like the fact that Giannis is, don't get me wrong, dude, like he's not like an elite jump shooter or anything, but I used to cringe when Giannis would ever take a jump shot. Like, just, what are we doing, man? Pass the ball. But now, like, he's legitimately taking them and making them with confidence. So I wonder if those elements, like him understanding his value as a playmaker, him shooting the ball now, I wonder if this is the best offensive version of Giannis we've seen. And I'm conflicted, man, because it's going to make me omit somebody that I really don't want to omit from this top 10. But I do think, I don't like particularly enjoy watching Giannis play basketball, but I think he probably is top 10 this century. But it's just going to make me boot somebody off my list that I don't want to have to.
I think you could always boot Giannis off the list. I mean,
I'm thinking about it.
There you go.
I think offensively, you could really make a case for these past 2 seasons. He's been the most efficient that he ever has been. And not only is he making more shots from mid-range, you can see that he's taking the outside shot a little bit less and he's starting to attack the rim more as he used to. Now, defensively, I do not think he's still the same player, because a few seasons ago, he was one of the best transition defenders in the league. He was such a great rim protector, help side rim protector. He can hold his own in space. But now that there's this relentless rim pressure that he does provide, now on top of that, throughout this short sample size, he's been able to make shots from the mid-range. So offensively, over the past 2 seasons, this has been the most efficient Giannis has been. I think offensively, you can make a case for this being his peak. You know, he's still extremely dominant inside 3 feet, whether it's in the paint non-restricted area. And now he's making mid-range shots on top of it. He's such a great player rolling to the basket, whether the ball is in his hands or not in his hands. The transition play is always going to be fantastic. So I think if he was the same level of defender he once was, you could really make the argument that Giannis is still at the peak.
Would be down there top 5. We talking about the same
honestly, because he's been extremely efficient and the playmaking has gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot better. So offensively, you could still make that argument that he is still at the top of his game.
Yeah, I do think this is the best Giannis has been offensively this season, season prior. The mid-range jumper, I do think, is a revelation. It's amazing. I think he's shooting 48% when I last checked. And I think the bigger thing is he's not shooting threes.
Yeah,
I think that's a bigger deal than the fact that he's making mid-range jumpers. The idea that Giannis was ever shooting more than 1 3 a game was a disgrace. So I think now that he's playing into his strengths, he's really buying into run and dunk, man, which I never viewed as slander. I viewed it as reality.
Like literally,
you can run and get to the rim. Go run and get to the rim. It's like calling Steph Curry a shooter. Oh no, I shoot. Like, I think it's a great thing that you do what you're best at. And then I do think his playmaking and his interior reads have really improved as of late. Before, Giannis used to be pretty much exclusively a driving kick guy, but now he's actually able to manipulate defenders, find guys in the dunker spot. That changes the lineups he can run with now. He doesn't need to exclusively play with stretch bigs. You can actually play him in different lineups, which I think is great. Now, the next step for the Bucks is getting Bobby Portis off the floor, but that's a whole new kind of worms. You don't need to. I just wanted to send Bobby Portis astray. I apologize, Bobby, if you're watching this. But yeah, I do think this is the best Giannis has been offensively. However, defensively, I do think there has been a regression year after year. I think the motor is going down, which is to be expected when he has such an offensive burden. I think there's many times now where he just gets caught where the Bucks perimeter defense before the Andre Jackson addition to the starting lineup was so bad that the amount of mistakes that Giannis would be expected to cover up kind of put him in positions where I can't really expect more of him. Like if he can cover up the first mistake, but then there's 3 more, how many of them am I really going to say Giannis is at fault for? I don't know what to do with that. When you look at his trying to remove himself from the situation, I always struggle with that. How much of a player's individual impact is based on their situation. I struggle to reconcile that quite often. But I do think if Giannis was his 2020 self defensively with this player offensively, I think we're looking at top 3, top 4 of the last 25 years, if I'm being 100% serious. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that. And I do think 2020 Giannis, 2021 Giannis was just too flawed offensively to be put into that top 5 conversation. And I want to ask you guys, does it bother you guys that Giannis has never led a good playoff offense? I'm not talking elite, just a good one. The Bucks have never really had a good playoff offense since Giannis has been at the helm. Is that cause for concern? Or do you think that's personnel? Do you think that's coaching? Or is it just bad luck in terms of matchups? What do you think the reason for that would be?
I mean, I kind of feel shortchanged. We haven't seen Giannis healthy the past couple of years. You know what I mean? Like this version of him that's been at his best, we just haven't seen because he's been injured. And to me, that's probably the bigger issue, right? Because now we're I was going to say we're creeping into Kawhi territory. We're not there yet because Kawhi's had a different level of availability. But I don't know if Giannis misses time in the playoffs again or can't play again, then I think we need to maybe be really, really concerned. That to me isn't. And the reason I say that is because you look at what that team's foundation was. It was them dominating defensively and then just doing enough offensively. And Giannis was, you guys correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, Giannis is probably the most dominant interior paint force since like prime Shaq, right? Like that version. I mean,
at the rim. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there was just nobody. He flipped that Sun series in the finals on its head, just took over in that series. So, don't get me wrong. When we're talking about all-time conversations like the peak, I do count it against him. I would rather have some all-time offensive engines than Giannis, but I don't necessarily hold it against him because of how great he was defensively and how great those teams were defensively. But when we're talking about these type of conversations, yeah, I do hold it against him a little bit, and that'll knock him down a few spots.
I think when I look at Giannis's game in the playoffs, when I look at the personnel around it, how many of those guys in that starting lineup really created easy offense? Like how many did Jrue Holiday really create easy offense at a high level? Did Chris Middleton really create easy offense at a high level? Chris Middleton really leaned on a lot of tough shot making. Jrue Holiday wasn't this above average offensive player. And when you have a guy like Giannis who is priding his game on collapsing defenses, being so dominant around the rim, we have guys who are not really, I wouldn't say above average offensive creators, but don't create easy offense to the level that you would need in a number 2 or a number 3. So I think that plays a big factor in it. And I think you made a great point in saying that leaning on the defense, that's what the Bucks did throughout their throughout the most recent playoff runs. So I don't necessarily hold it against him too much, but that is something that is to be considered when we have conversations like this.
I think that Logan made an important point, though. We haven't seen the peak version of Giannis that many times in the playoffs healthy, unfortunately. Like, I think we can agree he just keeps getting better on that side of the ball. But to me, 2021 and 2022, at that point, we had seen a leap offensively from Giannis. We didn't see the 2019, 2020 version who was being given fits by Toronto and Miami, these teams that had multiple really athletic big wings, or a Bam Adebayo who were going to build the wall, and his playmaking wasn't at the level it needed to be in those matchups. You could bait him into settling for more of those pull-up threes that he was struggling with. So it wasn't a surprise to me when those were not good playoff offenses. And then still 2021 and 2022, they weren't good playoff offenses, but I think that Giannis was significantly better offensively. And I think 2021, Drew was wildly inconsistent, really inefficient overall. The 3-point shooting around him was not good in that postseason. 2022, the 3-point shooting again was not good. Drew was brutal, and he didn't have Chris Middleton on the floor. So like, that Celtics series, to me, Giannis did everything with his skill set we could have expected of him offensively. Still, when we're going to talk about all these great peaks, I mean, Giannis is probably going to be in the conversation for the weakest half-court offensive player. That's never been what made him special, right? It's his defensive impact. It's his transition offense. And then it is the ability to still be a good half-court offensive player, but not at the sort of all-time level that we're seeing from a lot of these other dudes. So I would say that, yeah, that matters. But it's also not really like a revelation to me. Giannis isn't the level of half-court offensive player that these other dudes are. And generally, that's what's most valuable in the playoffs. You're not probably going to live in transition as much as you do in the regular season when Giannis is so great in transition that he can get you to top 5 offenses.
And I don't want to pressure anyone for specifics. Carson said he has him just outside the top 5. Logan said he thinks he might have him just inside the top 10. I'm not going to ask if you have them 8, 9, 10, but I just need to get some broad range. And John D, do you have Giannis inside the top 10?
Of the past 25 years, I would have him between the 9 and 11 range. I would have him between the 9 and 11 range.
Okay, so I think I'm just trying to make sure I keep track of everything. So I'm trying to make sure that everyone has their opinions jotted down a little bit. So Logan, would you have Giannis in a similar range as 9 to 11 or slightly higher?
Yeah, I think I have a rough draft. I'm debating on calling audibles here. I think I'd have Giannis 7. And the top 5, I think, is reserved for guys who are great on both sides of the ball. And then outside the top 5, at least, I don't know, man. It's tough with two guys.
There's someone
tough.
who
I was going to say
there's a polar bear.
There's tough with 2 guys.
I was going to say I think there's 2 polar bears who have to be there.
Yeah,
because they're
you
offensively.
have to be with someone already. Interesting.
They're at 5 and 6 for me. Giannis would be 7. That's in the range where if you're a liability on one side, that's when I kind of debate how high you can climb. But I've got Giannis at 7.
Okay, we've got 7, 9 through 11. And Carson, do you want to give a specific?
I think I have Giannis at 6. And I think the other factor here is, although like Logan, I value postseason more than regular season, Giannis is one of the greatest regular season engines that we've seen with his 2-way impact. And you just look at him consistently willing those Bucks teams all the way from 2019, even through last year, right? When he was out there on the floor, to being like 55 win teams. That's a rare thing to do for like a 6-year stretch. And I don't want to understate the value of that. That's a real advantage he has over some players who I would probably argue are slightly better playoff performers, but not that level regular season engines.
Thinking about it a little more, I think I've moved him up a spot or 2.
Damn, that quick.
Get him up there, John.
Down 10 toes, John. Come on.
Just thinking about it, I might move him up to 8 or 7. So put the 7 or 8 range.
Okay, I'll move him to 8. You're not getting 7. No, you're not getting 7. You had a 9. You don't get to 7. You get 8. Okay, so we've got a 6, 7, and 8. So you guys are in and around the same area. I want to just, because we've discussed, I want to say 4 players so far, 5 players. If you guys want us to discuss a player that you desperately want us to hear about, send a super chat. We'll move them to the top of the list of priorities. If not, you're just gonna have to wait for your player to come up. I'm sorry. Money talks. Speaking of which, Alan R, he said Luka last year is neck and neck with 18-19 Harden, in my opinion. And then he also said, shout out to KFC. We beat the Jalen Green comparisons. I seen Carson say some disgusting things about my glorious king, Jalen Green. So
sorry, man. That's your king. I am deeply sorry.
So we don't need to discuss that. But I do think we can quickly talk about Luka. I want to ask if he's done enough in his young career to be considered for this list or even make the list. I think I've asked you guys many times to start. So I'm going to start, actually. I'm going to take the reins on this one. No, I don't think Luka would be top 10. I do think he is having an all-time great offensive peak. I think what he's been able to do as that heliocentric engine I think the comparison to James Harden, I know it makes sense for a lot of people because of the step back threes, the isolation, the ball dominance, all of those things. It makes sense. But I do think the biggest difference is the layers to Luka's offensive attack, which I do think makes him the much better playoff translator as seen through the results. His ability to play with his back to the basket, his ability to stop in the mid-range, and then also still able to get to the rim, still able to make pull-up threes at an elite clip, especially what he did last year. It does make him, I think, the more well-rounded offensive player. I do think what separated James Harden a little bit just was the change of pace. Luka can go from slow to slower, but James Harden could go from slow to fast to slow. So I think he had more different gears that he could get to, which made him harder to stay in front of. But I do think Luka, his strength, his ability to get where he wants on the floor, and then he can make every pass out of pick and roll imaginable, whether that's skip passes, whether that's laydowns, whether that's lobs, and then being able to manipulate defenders, unlike anyone in the league right now, except a certain Serbian who he's ridiculous, but he doesn't count right now. And then defensively, I do think he's not as bad as I think the consensus is with him. I still would paint him as a negative, but I work with people who have said he's the worst defender of all time. I don't agree with that. I don't think he's that bad of a defender. I do think he's a negative. I do think when he's dialed in, he can give you stretches of positive impact, but overall, I do think he would be a negative due to motor issues. But his size is a positive. His post defense is a positive. If you put him on slower footed wings, I do think he can stick with them for a couple moves. But once you do get by him, the effort does wane. I'm not expecting extra rotations from Luka Doncic. I'm never going to expect that. I think you're a fool if you do. I do think his defensive rebounding can be somewhat valuable. And I do think he is a very active communicator on defense. Now, sometimes it's him complaining at his teammates for his failures, but I do still think he is an active communicator. But I do think the hesitation for me would just be about his fit next to other people. And always his impact numbers have always not been as great as you would expect. And I've always struggled to not understand why, but I've always been curious as to why he doesn't have the gaudy offensive impact numbers that a Steph Curry or a Jokic or a LeBron James had. And I'm curious if you guys have a possible explanation for that. But that is why I would hold Luka just outside of the top 10 for now. But if you guys have a reason for the offensive impact numbers looking as pedestrian as they do, go ahead, shoot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the raw unselfishness of those guys. And there's just I think Luka can also have his negative impact sometimes, like with when he's settling for, pull-up jumpers. And don't get me wrong, when you can hit a pull-up three at like a 38 to a 40% clip, it's a good shot. But there's just going to be games where inherently those shots aren't falling. And like Steph, dude, you can't even quantify the stuff that Steph does, like how much he can do off ball. And Jokic is going to kill you with there's just a flow and a movement to those offenses that I think a guy is heliocentric that Luka just can't tap into. And I think that's what is reflective in the numbers. The one thing I'll add about Luka, he's not in my top 10 right now. I think he is the most likely active player to join this list along with, and hear me out here, don't kill the messenger. I think Jason Tatum has an opportunity as well with just his well-rounded impact if we finally see him put the offensive game together in the playoffs. I'm just saying there's a potential. I could see.
So you think he can be better than Dwyane Wade?
I think that Tatum could climb. Don't get me wrong. He's not close yet, but he has to. I think Tatum has just never performed, or at least in this last playoff run, performed so far below expectations scoring the ball that I'm just saying he's got the potential to put it all together. He has the ability that I can see him putting it all together. But I think Luka is the most likely to join this list. But he's frustrating, man. The one thing I would say is that same thing with Harden. Me as a basketball player, I would struggle if I was a teammate of those guys sometimes, just with their play style and how, again, with Steph and Jokic, there's a natural flow. I'm playing for my teammate. We're trying to all create the best shot. And I feel like Luka can just, pound the air out the rock the way a Harden did. And it would frustrate me at times with his defensive engagement and with his selfishness. But I think Luka's got the best chance of any active player to join this list.
Wemby notwithstanding, I presume.
I was going to ask.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah, okay. Duh.
Okay. I would agree with that then. But I would have Luka just off. And I think What's interesting is last year we would probably have to define as the best version of Luka we've seen up to this point, but it was also the worst postseason version of Luka we've seen. And obviously he was banged up, right, with various injuries. But some of the stuff I think goes beyond the injuries, right? Like just that brutal pull-up jump shooting variance where he's horrible against the Celtics as a pull-up shooter. He's horrible against the Clippers, and he gets going in between second half of the Thunder series and then the Western Conference Finals. He's really, really good as a pull-up shooter, but like overall, that can tank your efficiency when you're relying on 10 threes a night and you're shooting them at such a low clip like we saw with Harden, and it can take your offense out of rhythm. And generally, when you're a playmaker of Luka's caliber, when you have his touch, I always say good things happen when you get into the paint. And I think this version of Luka that we've seen the last couple of years hasn't been as willing to consistently impose himself as a driver as younger Luka, 2020 Luka, 2021 Luka, who did have those incredible postseasons. But I'd still say last year was the best because of the continual added strength and because that was the best he's ever been as a shooter in the regular season, significantly better. It just didn't translate to the playoffs. And defensively, he was horrible against the Celtics. I agree with you, Marz. I would say overall, he's just a bad defender. He's not a horrible defender, but there are times where the focus is just beyond inexcusable. It's like an actual embarrassment. And when you are going to pair that with being this super ball dominant offensive engine who sometimes isn't the most efficient and can be overly reliant on these pull-up jumpers where he's not an elite pull-up shooter, like, those are all red flags when it comes to building a title team around a superstar. So I've always felt Luka's so talented that like he's going to will a team to a title one year, but there are aspects of his skill set that do make it tougher than a lot of the other guys who we're talking about today.
Yeah, and a lot of people are really low on Luka right now. I've seen some nasty tweets. But I still think he's one of the best pick and roll decision makers in the league, maybe top 2, probably number 1. And then you add that with the volume of shooting and not being able to blitz him in the pick and roll because he makes the great decisions out of that, whether it's a lob to Derek Lively or whether it's a corner pass to Klay Thompson. And the strength that he has brought onto his game now over the past few seasons does make him a very solid finisher, very good finisher around the rim. The problem is he's not doing that as much. So you would love to see him attack the rim a little bit more because once again, he's going to attract 2 defenders. He's going to make the proper decision, whether it's skip passes, bounce passes, lob passes. It's just, once again, the defense and him being the best player, him being one of the best players in the league. People are always going to put a magnifying glass on that. I've seen a lot of bad defenders in my lifetime of watching basketball, and now people are really jumping on Luka because his defensive mishaps are glorified a lot more than another terrible defender.
I mean, Isaiah Thomas and Muggsy Bogues existed,
yeah, those guys were like, yeah,
next level.
I wouldn't say Muggsy is the worst defender ever.
No, I'm just saying he could get some steals. I'm just saying with the size, like I think Isaiah is probably the worst just because he was so tiny. But again, there's just like you said, Marz, like Luka's a big body. Like he can match up against certain guys when other guys are just complete liabilities in every matchup.
Yeah, as Isaiah would probably be my pick off the top of my head. If someone just said who's the worst defender ever, he would be the first name I would think of.
Yeah.
And if I really thought about it, he probably still would be the pick, but there would be other honorable mentions. An honorable mention would be Damian Lillard. Jesus Christ, he was really bad. Trae Young a few years ago. Now I still think he's horrible, but I don't know if he's the worst defender ever anymore. So there's guys who are clearly worse than Luka. But so I think that's unanimous. No one has Luka on the list for now, but give him the possibility to make it. We don't have to discuss this, but just real quick, Luka or James Harden?
Luka for me.
I'd take Luka.
I think that you hit on it, Marz. I think it's the layers offensively that makes them scale better to the playoffs. The willingness to utilize the mid-range, the willingness to work out of the post. I just prefer that more shot variety, I should say. And I also do think that he's the better playmaker. So I think that Luka's like probably about the 12th best offensive engine ever right now. I think he's great. It's just, there's a lot of insane peaks since 2000.
Would you put Luka over Dwyane Wade as well?
Man, that's really hard. That's really, really hard. I don't know if I could right now. Again, if we're looking at last year as Luka's peak, he really, really struggled in the postseason. I think much more than people discuss just because the Mavs were winning. Man, that's really hard. I actually think I am going to lean Luka because I do prefer him as an offensive engine in the playoffs to a Harden who would be, something of an equivalent stylistically. I think Luka's a really, really amazing offensive player, but that's very close because of the two-way difference.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got Luka, Wade, Harden 1 through 3. Interesting.
I think
wonder
so.
how the people gonna feel about that. I know there's some Wade fans in the chat already not very happy. But that's what we're here for, man. We're here to discuss these things. Logan, if you had to rank them 1 through 3, who would you go with? Luka, Wade, and Harden?
I'd go with Wade right now just because he does have like the accomplishments and was never as a big a defensive liability as Luka. That's close, but just because we saw D Wade climb the mountain, and like Carson said, I think Luka is so good that he's eventually just going to carry the Mavs to the title, and then we can, stamp him. But I got to see him do it first. And there's a little part of me that worries that maybe he does have a James Harden arc to his career just because of how great the teams are across the league, right? Like Denver's not going anywhere. Boston's not going anywhere. OKC's not going anywhere. San Antonio is about to be really, really competitive once Wemby comes around. Like there's no guarantee that Luka gets his ring. So I'll hold it down for Wade until Luka actually climbs the mountain. I'll stick with D Wade.
I'm gonna go with Dwyane Wade as well. I'm gonna go Dwyane, Luka, and then Harden. I do really value the two-way effort from Dwyane Wade. I also really value the rim pressure. I think that's something that's more sustainable. But once again, Luka is a fantastic offensive player. But I'm gonna lean D Wade here.
So my bearded goat is cooked. That's what I'm hearing. Okay, cool. Great. We got a couple super chats, and then we're gonna get into some names that I know people want to hear about. So we're gonna start with Sorry Key. He said, "I know this isn't his convo, but can Trae Young get here?" I wanted to say no.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say no.
But I do want to say I do think he is one of the best passers in the NBA. Easily,
absolutely.
Probably, if I'm being honest, I probably think he's the third best passer in the NBA. I think, unless I'm forgetting
Jokic, Luka
over LeBron still.
I mean, I think at this point, if you're saying LeBron,
I
think at this point, if you're saying LeBron, it's out of respect for the way he can still see the floor. But if we're talking about like the actual
including advantage
and
creation,
what they're actually doing, yes.
What about Hallie? The game the other night was rough.
I think Trae is a substantially better passer than Halliburton, if I'm
really
being honest. Yeah,
because of pick and roll, just because of lob passing or what?
I think pick and roll. I think his overall half court creation. I think his ability to find guys under the rim is more consistent. I do think Hallie. I'm not going to say he's a benefactor of pace because he's responsible for a lot of that pace, but I just do think in the half court, I think Trae can get the ball into windows that Hallie wouldn't even dare to try. And I do value the higher risk, higher reward passing. So that's where I'm at with it.
They're very close. I would agree. I would say that Trae is the better lob passer, the better interior passer. I would say that Hallie is a significantly better transition passer and a significantly more willing ball mover. And I would probably say a slightly better skip passer as well, just with the height advantage. So I think it's very close. Honestly, I think that I prefer the style of offense that Hallie plays, right? I think that Trae is that sort of super ball dominant, can make every decision. But I also think that Hallie is the sort of guy who is constantly amplifying the dudes around him by moving the ball quickly, taking advantage of the advantages that he creates. I think that's very close, but I think they're definitely both top 5 right now.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I'd probably have to agree with that. And then we got 2 super chats from Terry with 2 dads. We don't judge. How good do you think the Dyson and Herb Jones wing duo would be? Well, the issue is that wing duo would have existed if they didn't trade him. And I have no comments on the DeJounte trade, but I do think that would have been a great wing duo. I think Dyson just needed the opportunity and needed to grow offensively to really be a big part of a playoff team. But I think Dyson as one of the best guard/wing defenders in the NBA, and Herb is probably the best wing defender in the NBA, unless I'm forgetting someone, but whatever. The best wing defender in the NBA. I do think that was going to be a great duo, and especially in New Orleans when you surround that with Zion Williamson, the most dangerous non-Giannis downhill threat in the NBA probably. And then obviously coming up for his defensive shortcomings. I do think that would have been great, but they decided to bail on that and get DeJounte Murray, who I think is one of the most overrated players in the NBA. But yeah, I think it's disappointing we never got to see it unfold and how good it really could have been, because I was very high on that wing duo.
You have someone on the perimeter. My bad, Marz. Were you?
No, I'm done. I was going to get into a whole Dyson Glaze fest, and I didn't want to do that. So thank you for stopping it.
You have somebody with Herb Jones who is such a great one-on-one defender on the perimeter. His wingspan is spectacular. His hands are great. And then you have Dyson Daniels, who is fantastic with his hands, fantastic with playing in the passing lane. So I think that would have been very suffocating.
I think
rough offensively, though, fellas. That would have been rough offense.
Yeah, but who needs good offense when you've got elite defense? We're here, we might only score 86 points, but if you score 84, we still win.
What I mean, even if Dyson was like your sixth guy, like I think New Orleans really flubbed it. And don't get me wrong, New Orleans may never figure it out because Zion Williamson just may never be healthy enough to do it. But I mean, Herb, Trae, Dyson around Zion, like these are guys that work. Like you said, they make up for Zion's defensive shortcomings. I think they screwed it all up. I mean, like nobody obviously could have seen this injury bug coming around, but the fact that you gave up a pick and Dyson and he's balling like this, I think New Orleans screwed up big time with that deal.
Not to like get off on a whole New Orleans segment, but I think a lot of it does have to do with the health of Zion Williamson. I think they really haven't gotten the opportunity to really build a team around Zion's strengths because we're always having that thought in the back of my mind that he may go down. So I think for the past couple of seasons, we've been looking at, let's get the best talent in the door in New Orleans instead of really building the proper team around Zion, because I've always thought that Herb Jones and Trey Murphy would be better next to Zion than CJ and Brandon Ingram. But they don't want to take that risk because if Zion goes down and we win 22 games, now the head coach might get fired, the general manager might get fired. I think that's the play they're making. Bring in as much talent as we possibly can because our number one, it's always a question is he going to be able to be available and be on the floor? I think that's the biggest part of it.
I always point to it because it's one game, but I don't know if you guys remember that play-in game from a couple years ago. It was awesome. Zion goes, I think it was against LA, and they closed. Was it last year?
It was literally like 6 months ago,
dude. It feels
you guys remember,
dude. It feels so long ago, but I mean, they closed that game with Alvarado, with Larry Nance Jr. Like they were riding the hot hands. I think with Herb and Trae, and it's
Trey Murphy was lighting it on fire,
and they were going off. I also hate that those games aren't. Sorry, this is just a gripe. I hate that those games aren't like counted as real games. They don't even have the stats from those games. How is that not a playoff game, man?
No, it's that Zion 40 piece just doesn't exist.
Erased from history, man.
That's why Logan thought it was 3 years ago. So
I couldn't find it, man.
Yeah. See, I can't blame you, but it's crazy that New Orleans would have had Dyson, Najee Marshall, and Herb Jones, but instead they have DeJounte Murray. DeJounte Murray is my New Orleans Bobby Portis, so that's where I'm at. Another final super chat from Terry with two dads, and then we will get back into the list. He said, in an alternate scenario where peak Jason Kidd had the shooting ability he displayed during his Dallas years, where would he rank all time? Interesting. How much does Jason Kidd being a competent shooter in his peak affect his all-time ranking for you guys, if at all?
I think that it would have made a significant difference. I mean, I think that you saw he became a much more capable off-ball player in those later years and is legitimately in the conversation for the greatest, most impactful defensive guard ever, just with his versatility at his size. And I think not everybody fully appreciates like what the backbone of those Nets teams were. Like he comes in 2002 when they become the number one defense in basketball, when the year before they were a well below average defense. And that's not all Jason Kidd, but a lot of that is Jason Kidd. And then offensively, I think he can kind of get overrated because he's one of the 5 greatest passers we've ever seen. No question, an absolute magician. At the same time, brutally inefficient scorer. And, although he was still like a pretty solid offensive floor raiser, and you look at their offensive on-off numbers in those years with the Nets, and he's making like 10 points per 100 possessions better, he wasn't a guy who was really a high-end ceiling raiser offensively. So if he was able to bring that peak defensive impact and that peak athleticism with the shooting that he developed later on, I don't know, maybe that's like a top 30 player of all time, because I think right now I'd have him in the 40s.
Interesting. I don't
maybe
even know
not
how Jason Kidd would rank, but
maybe in the 30s. I don't know.
Where would that rank amongst point guards? I think that's easier. Where would that rank amongst point guards?
Okay, that's a good question. Does that put him past Nash if you were a significantly better shooter? I think it might. Right now I have Nash over him because Nash is just the greatest offensive engines ever.
How good of a shooter do you think Jason Kidd became? I guess that's the question.
Well, I'm saying there were years where he was like 37% on pretty good volume. If you're looking at like the later 2008, 2010, he's up above 40% 2 of those years, 38%. And if we're pairing that with his peak defensive impact,
he was 41% across those 2 seasons. So is that the Jason? 42% actually. Is that the Jason Kidd we're assuming we have? 41%.
A lot of that was off the catch though too. It's not like he ever
That's what I was
like
going to say. How much are we valuing self-generation? And
that's fair. I just think he was such a defensive monster. I mean, I definitely have Nash above him now by a decent bit because Nash was just an automatic #1 offense in the 2000s. But a significantly better jump shot would have made Jason Kidd a real monster at his peak.
The offense becomes a lot easier for him as well. The reads become a lot easier. The drives to the rim get a lot easier now that you have to really guard him and step up. I don't know if I would put him above Nash though. I just think the pick and roll offense Nash provided, the way he was able to drive to the rim pressure he provided, the efficiency from mid range, the way he was able to play off ball, how portable he was. It's tough.
Not to harp on this too. I do think there's an alternate universe where if Jason Kidd could shoot better, you see even worse shot selection than what he actually had in his prime. So there is the concern of Jason Kidd was taking pull-up threes in transition when he couldn't even shoot. So now if Jason Kidd can shoot, what if he's now shooting 9 threes a game in 2002? You don't know. So I think
you're saying Steve Nash defeats hypothetical man here.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna do anything to defend Steve Nash. So yes.
Now, listen, I love Nash. And I do want to be clear. We are debating hypothetical man versus Nash here. We're not debating Jason Kidd versus Nash. We're saying, what if we took all of Jason Kidd's best traits from various stages and put them into one player? I think it'd be very close then. But real life, it's definitely Steve Nash over Kidd.
Yeah, I'm very adamant on the Steve Nash over Jason Kidd train. But I do think we need to get back to the list. And I want to talk about someone who I think a lot of people are curious to hear our opinions on. And I think we might anger some people, but I think we got to do it anyway. Kobe Bryant, very polarizing player. For some people, top 3 player of all time. For some people, not even top 10. So I'm curious, where do you guys stand on peak Kobe Bryant relative to the last 25 years? I know we've got the 7 spot taken and the #1 spot taken. So I'm curious, where does Kobe fall amongst that mix? I'm gonna start with Logan. Where does Kobe Bryant fall for you?
Dude, I was asking my dad this question last night. My dad is one of those Kobe's top 3. I think he's got Jordan 1, Kobe 2, and then I think he had Larry and then Kareem and then LeBron. I thought it was really disrespectful to LeBron, but Kobe is in my top 10, and I went back and forth on this. I have Kobe at number 8, right behind Giannis, and it's tough because I think everybody, when they talk about Kobe, right, they point to the 5 titles and they make that a big component of their argument. And ironically, I don't think Kobe won a championship when he was at his absolute apex, right? Like him and Shaq in those early years, it's Shaq carrying him, and then Kobe on the last 2 rings is really contributing, right? Him and Shaq are a dominant duo. And then in his later years, when he wins finals MVP, he's not at his athletic peak, and those teams are way better, right? You got Powell, you got Bynum, you got Metta World Peace for one of those runs, you got Ariza. I think Kobe's peak, I put 06 to 08, and you kind of feel for the guy, right? Like, I wouldn't pass the ball to Smush Parker or Chris Mim neither, right? I probably would have been jacking up all those shots. One of the misconceptions I think about Kobe that I want to dispel is that, Kobe couldn't pass. No, Kobe didn't like to pass. Kobe could pass. He was a good passer, right? He could, but I've got Kobe at number 8 because I think he deserves to be here with his all-around game and his impact, right? He's got the 2-way impact. I just don't think he can be any higher for me because I think there are greater offensive engines that we see that I would rather have to Kobe. And then below him, I have guys that are bigger liabilities on one end of the floor. I don't think hit as high of a peak as Kobe, but I tend to think Kobe's peak was 06 to 08. Those years he's given you, 32 points a game, and he was doing his thing in the playoffs too. It's just unfortunate that I don't think he had – it's like what you said earlier, Marz, about judging guys within the context of the guys that were around him. I don't think those teams were equipped to go and win a title around him. but I do think that was Kobe's peak, and I think it is a top 10 peak of the 2000s. So Kobe was, I think Kobe was the toughest player to rank on this list, bar none. But I think he deserves to be here, and he's in my number 8 spot.
I had Kobe, or just kind of trying to put a list together. I had Kobe around 5 to 7. I think with his mid-range scoring, and when Andrew Bynum got there and Pau Gasol got there, he was really good at running the spread pick and roll, whether it was getting to the rim efficiently or making those tough shots in the mid-range and really manipulating defenses at times, whether it was let me leak out to the corner and hit Andrew Bynum around the rim, and also the two-way upside that Kobe provided. I would have him around 5 or 7. I would have him around 5 or 7.
What do you consider his peak, John? What period of Kobe are you
06
looking
to
at?
08 as well.
06
06
to 08.
to 08 as well.
Interesting. Okay. Carson?
I think that's interesting too. I mean, I would say that is his offensive peak. I think that you can look at the raw volume numbers and like they're super impressive, but what sometimes gets lost is no, those weren't great teams. They were top 8 offenses every year from 05 to 07, which is like the actual talent drought, right? Because then 2008, you bring in Powell midway through that season. That's really impressive. Kobe is one of the toughest players ever to talk about because it feels like a vast majority of people are too far on either one pole or the other, where they have him top 3 or they live for Kobe slander. I don't want to be in either one of those camps. I do think I'm probably lower on him than the average, though. And he had such like a mystifying offensive skill set, right? Because he's the greatest difficult shot maker we've ever seen. And that's such an incredible thing to watch. That footwork, that balance, the audacity he had as a shot maker, spinning over either shoulder, right? He could do everything. The fadeaways are unbelievable. And he was a really good off-ball scorer. And I do think he can be underrated as a playmaker and an overall offensive engine by those who are low on him. At the same time, when we're looking at this version of Kobe you guys are talking about, who wasn't at his peak athletically, he just didn't generate the most valuable shots when we're talking about these elite offensive engines. Okay, if we're going to compare him to a Steph or a Jokic or a LeBron or these other great offensive players post-2000, who some people will tell you he's better than, those guys are able to manufacture the most valuable shots for themselves and their teammates, those being open threes, those being looks at and around the rim. Kobe was very reliant on that mid-range heavy shot diet, and it's just tough, man. It's just tough. A quarter of his shots, more actually came from the deep mid-range, and he was a 40% career shooter from that range. So he's a great offensive engine. He is not one of those tier 1 offensive engines like the dudes who I just mentioned. And then I do think he gets overrated defensively by some people. I think when you're talking about early Kobe, right? 2000, 2001 Kobe, when he was at his peak athletically, that was a really, really good defensive player. Once you're getting to 2004 and beyond, 2004 through 2013, the Lakers were actually a worse defense with him on the floor more than half of those years. And he had his very good moments on ball. He also was not the most impactful team defender, was not always the most attentive defender. So overall, I say in that stretch of his career, he's like a solid defender, but he's not near the caliber that the all defense selections would have suggested. I think a lot of those were reputation based. So I think I have Kobe at number 9 on my list. I think that I'm the lowest. I think that there are more efficient all-time great offensive engines, and there are more truly dominant two-way players. Like I would prefer Giannis's dominance defensively and his ability to will himself to 31, 12, and 6 on really good efficiency in a postseason to what you get from Kobe, which is very good offensive engine, solid defensive impact.
Just to, I guess, provide a little bit of pushback, not really pushback, more so a question. Does it hold value, or how much value does it provide that even though Kobe isn't manufacturing the easiest looks or the most efficient looks, whether that's open threes or layups or free throws, that he was so dangerous from all over the floor, and that his, I want to say, resiliency in the postseason, especially in that stretch, was some of the best we've ever seen? Is that valuable that he's able to maintain? He never was the +10, +8 efficiency guy,
right?
Some other guys were, but he was able to maintain his +3, +4 against really good defenses from 06 to 08. I think the only series he had that was, I guess, below average efficiency would be that 08 finals. And Boston did some very unique things defensively, and Kevin Garnett is a player we're going to talk about soon. Does that hold any water to you that he was able to maintain his scoring proficiency regardless of defense because of how dangerous he was from all over the floor?
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes we can underrate the defensive attention that great offensive players do draw if it isn't literally just drawing help at the rim, right? If it's just a soft double at the elbow, right? Or if it's just the eyes of a second defender who's going to sink in a little bit for help. I think that Kobe is somebody who was prolific in drawing that sort of help. And he was an incredible, incredible shot maker. And he was resilient in the playoffs, especially in those later years, which is why I agree with the peak that both John and Logan picked for Kobe. I mean, I would even extend that probably through the 2010 season because he's not the same defensive player, but I do think he's a more consistent, complete offensive player than he was at his athletic peak. That absolutely matters. Like, I think that Kobe is an amazing player. I just think there were dudes who manufactured more seamless offense. And I think that those dudes who I'm talking about also held up in the postseason and generated those same sort of great results.
Y'all know
So
what
do
I...
you-
Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead, Marz.
No, you the guest. I'm gonna just ask a whole new
I was
question.
just gonna say something funny. I do think it's funny how everybody always talks about LeBron's legacy getting saved by Ray Allen, and nobody talks about Kobe getting bailed out by Ron Artest. Man, Ron
Oh, God.
I
Artest
knew that was coming.
got the offensive rebound against the Suns to send them there, and then hit the game-winning shot. Also, Kobe passed the ball to Ron right there, so Kobe didn't like to pass, but he could.
Making the right play. That's what that is.
Bro,
Making the right play.
I mean, if we're talking legacy saver, what about Powell too? I mean, Kobe goes 6 of 24 in Game 7, 2010. Powell gives you 19 and 18. Is kind of doing everything in that game.
I mean, I don't think anyone was efficient in that game.
No, I don't think Powell was efficient either, but he was a monster in that game.
I want to also shout out to the Kobe in that 2010 Western Conference Finals. I think that's the best he's ever looked in a series. My question was going to be to, I think Carson and Logan both had Kobe behind Giannis. Do you value Giannis as a better offensive player than Kobe, or is it the two-way impact that's
I don't think it's close offensively.
Yeah,
but I also don't think it's close defensively.
Okay, I just wanted to see where we were going with Kobe, and I think John D has Kobe the highest at 537. I want to talk a little bit about Kobe's most notorious teammate or best teammate, who I expect to have a unanimous agreement on where he places here, but we'll see. I want to talk about Shaq. I think this should be unanimous, but I'm just gonna come out and say I have Shaq at number 2. I think he's the second best peak of the last 25 years, 99, 2000 through to like 2001, 2002. I think once you get to 2003, the weight gain is noticeable. The effort on defensive decline is noticeable. And also, I think one thing that gets slept on is there was a major free throw decline as well. He was never a good free throw shooter, but I think by 03, 04, it gets really, really, really concerning to the point where he's not even really providing great offense with his free throws. I know I went viral a few years ago for saying Shaq shooting free throws wasn't that detrimental to half-court offense when you look at it statistically, because the fact of the matter is in the mid-2000s, a half-court possession was about 0.85 points per possession. You get a 50% free throw shooter, you're getting plus 15 offense. And that was considered the best way to stop Shaq, was plus 15 offense. And I think that's a testament to his greatness, that people really thought that the best way to stop Shaq was the equivalent of maybe the best offense of all time. I think his interior dominance is the best of all time. We spoke about Giannis a little bit, but I don't think he matches Shaq. I think his ability to park himself near the rim was more valuable than someone driving. I think his constant off-ball activity and movement, drawing, like Carson alluded to with Kobe, but drawing multiple eyes or multiple bodies. It's more than just a double on the catch. It's the idea that you are sinking on Shaq the moment he's posting up. Even if the ball is nowhere near him, before the reversal even happens, you've committed 3 defenders. That opens up driving lanes. And then I think one thing that gets slept on in terms of spacing is Shaq was such a threat crashing the offensive glass. Bigs wouldn't leave his body. So when you drive, you're not getting help at the rim from the big because they won't leave Shaq. And if they do leave Shaq, he's cleaning up. So I think he provided spacing in a way that doesn't get understood because he's not shooting the 3, but he did give his teammates driving angles. He did give them lanes, and he did give them room to operate in an era where room to operate was hard to come by. I also think he was a very underrated passer. I think his playmaking gets rated correctly because of the attention he drew, but his ability to make reads out of the post, his ability to find guys cutting, find the occasional skip pass. He was pretty one-dimensional in terms of he could only make passes with his right hand, it seems, but we'll let that slide. And then defensively, as a rim deterrent in the early 2000s, I don't think there was anyone better than him. People didn't want.
You don't think there was anyone better than him? Dikembe?
As a pure deterrent, I think Dikembe was a better better paint protector. But in terms of we don't want to go near you,
I would take Dikembe still.
I'm not gonna argue. I'm
Okay.
definitely not gonna argue. I think Dikembe did slip my mind, but I do think Shaq is in that realm of elite rim deterrent. That's what I'll say. I do think he's in that realm of elite rim deterrent. No one wanted to go near him. If you did go near him, you were running into 300 pounds of whatever Shaq's made of, and it was a painful experience. So I think that defensive upside, I do think there was a time where he was one of the 5 most impactful defenders in the sport, combined with being by far the best offensive player in the league. For a small stretch. It wasn't a long time. I'm not one of those people who believe Shaq's peak extended from like 96 to 2003. I do think it was a very short span, but those 2 or 3 seasons are some of the highest level of basketball I think we've ever seen. And if we want to play the hypothetical game, I think Shaq is 80% free throw shooting away from being the best peak we've ever seen. That's how high I rate how good he was. But I have him at number 2. I'm hoping you guys do as well. But
yeah,
what do you guys think of Shaq's peak and when was it?
I had Shaq's peak at 2000 to 2002. Over that span in the playoffs, about 30 points, 15 rebounds, 3 blocks. And I think you covered a lot of things I was going to say. He parked himself around the rim effortlessly, his movement off ball, the way he was able to shield guys off and get an immediate great shot as soon as he got the ball down low, his decision-making out of the post, whether it was bounce passes to a cutter, swings to the corner. That's just a really efficient way to generate basketball when you have somebody who's so dominant down low and is so efficient around the rim. You're going to always generate great offense. And he was great in drop coverage. He's a great rim deterrent, like you said. There's a lot of things that made Shaq very dominant. I had him number 2.
I also had him number 2. And to your point, Marz, I mean, when we're talking all-time peaks, I wouldn't have him as my greatest of all time, but I would hear an argument. Shaq is one of those guys, those 3 seasons, I would hear an argument for him over anybody else. I have him, I think, as my 6th greatest peak all time. This is not just in the last 25 years, but I mean, dude, what he's doing in those finals, 2000 finals, he gives you 38, 17, and 2. 01, he gives you 33, 16, and 5. 02, he gives you 36, 12, and 4. All 3 of those seasons, he wins the finals. He is a finals MVP. And he's a league MVP one of those years. There was no answer. And I mean, rare do you get just a 3-year run of utter dominance where he is clearly the best player on the planet. And to your point too, I mean, one of the best defenders on the planet, the most unstoppable offensive force on the planet. And the way people were talking about Shaq back then was, is this the greatest peak of all time? You know, they're throwing him in MJ and Wilt conversations, and I think he deserves it. And I think he's sometimes a little bit underrated defensively. I mean, I think in that 01 run, I think the Lakers had the best playoff defense in the league. Shaq's a monster. I wouldn't argue anybody above him at number 2. I think that Shaq is deservedly at that spot.
There's one dude I might deign to argue. There's one dude who I think is actually very close. I don't have him above Shaq. I have Shaq at my number 2. I do think that kind of the key point, I'm just going to come out and say it. I think Jokic is the dude who is closest to Shaq's peak. I think he's the top 3 peak. Yeah, because I do think that Jokic is the better offensive player. I think Jokic is the greatest offensive player we've ever seen. I think if the gap comes down to how big do you think the 2-way difference is, and I think it's big enough to give Shaq the edge when you're talking about absolute peak 2000, when he anchors a number 1 regular season defense, in 2001, when, as Logan mentions, he anchors the best playoff defense. I might not be quite as high on his defense as Marz. Like, I would definitely take Dikembe, although you said he slipped your mind. But I also think Zoe in 2000, clearly a better defensive player than Shaq. You're talking about pure deterrence, hear an argument, but I think that Duncan was definitely a better defender overall than Shaq in that era.
Better defender.
Yeah.
But he was that sort of all defense caliber rim protector because he was really committed for the entire 2000 season and then that 2001 postseason. And when he's also giving you in the finals 36, 15, 3.5, 3 blocks a night on insane efficiency. And that doesn't even account for all of the gravity, all of the attention that he draws. And I'm with you, Marz. I think he's probably underrated as a passer. Absolute 2-way monster. There's a reason people call him the most unstoppable player to ever play this game. And he could really propel you to elite heights on both sides of the ball. So he's my number 2 peak as well.
I think you connected to a great segue saying you have Jokic number 3. So I think now we can absolutely open the floor to you having Jokic at 3. I think some people don't agree with that, but I've heard you speak about Jokic, but I've never heard you say 3rd best peak of the last 25 years. So go ahead, make the case.
I just think we're looking at one of the greatest 5-year runs in the history of this sport now. Since 2022, the Nuggets are a team that plays as equivalent to the best team in the league. With Jokic on the floor, they have a plus minus of like 11 per 48 minutes. And with him, they're the worst team in the league. They're like minus 10. So that's a 21-point swing when you take him on the floor compared to off it. That doubles all the other elite players in basketball, right? Giannis, Embiid, Luka, all these dudes who have been considered among the big four alongside Jokic. He's doubling them in terms of that swing. And you can talk about, well, the Nuggets play their starters together a lot. Those numbers hold when you take any one of those other key players off the floor, Jamal Murray, Aaron Gordon, MPJ. I do think that he's the greatest offensive engine ever. And I think that a key part of that is, to me, a Jokic post-up is the most unstoppable action in basketball history because he is the strongest player in the league today, because he has the best post footwork in the league today, and because he has far and away the best paint touch that we've ever seen, where he literally shoots 65 to 70% on those hooks and floaters year after year. We've never seen anything like that. And when you add on top of that, the fact that he is the best passer in the league today, the best post hub at spotting cutters ever, the best skip passer out of the post ever, there is no answer, right? He is, to me, the most unstoppable scorer in basketball, because if there is one dude who just sets his mind to scoring in single coverage, nothing is more impossible to stop than a Jokic post-up. And on top of that, he's the best passer in basketball. And on top of that, he's the best rebounder in basketball. And he's an incredibly versatile offensive player, right? The guy can curl around screens and he can kill you from the mid-range. The three ball has come back in a huge way for him this year. He's the best outlet passer that we've ever seen. He's one of the best screeners in basketball today. He is an incredible pick and roll man, right? He can spot Aaron Gordon in the dunker spot off the short roll, faking the floater, turning that into a lob. The floater touch there is the best that we've ever seen. He is just an incredibly versatile offensive weapon, the likes of which we've never seen from a big, who also has the most unstoppable action ever in his back pocket and is simultaneously the best scorer and passer in the league. And the efficiency is like nothing we've ever seen, right? Last 5 years, he's 26, 12, and 9 on 66% true shooting in the regular season. And he gets even better in the playoffs. He's 30, 13, and 8 on 62% true shooting. And the on-off numbers, the difference I was talking about, we haven't seen from any player except for Pete Kevin Garnett in his range from like 2002 to 2004. But Jokic honestly is even surpassing that in totality over this 5-year stretch. So I think that he's a fine defensive player. There are those who will want to tell you that he's a very good defender because of his rebounding value, because he has such good hands, because he's so smart. I don't disagree that he's very good in all of those aspects. I just think when you're as limited athletically as he is at the center spot, when you're as limited as a rim protector, you can't really be an active plus. So I think that he's a fine defensive player, but again, the greatest offensive player that we've seen. I think that we've seen that in various situations. I think you see that with his floor raising when you take a 2022 team or when you take this year's team at various points, when Jamal is out, when Aaron Gordon is out, and with Jokic on the floor, their offensive rating is the best we've seen. And from any team ever, to be clear. And when he's off the floor, it's the worst we've seen from any team in the modern era. That's the impact that he has been sustaining for 5 years. And I think that he plays a style of basketball that amplifies everybody around him, regardless of their skill set, that incentivizes movement without the ball, that makes everyone around him look better. And then when it comes down to it, you just cannot stop the dude in single coverage. So the efficiency, the impact, the skill set, to me, is the best offensive player we've seen. And that's enough for him to be my number 3 peak.
So very good case. But Logan, I know you said that you can't have non-two-way players in your top 5. I'm curious, is Jokic an exception?
I knew this was coming from Carson. I'm not surprised, and he always breaks it down. Carson's been giving this spiel for about 4 years now, man. He was ahead of the curve on the Jokic train. One of our first YouTube videos that blew up, it was Carson saying he was the greatest offensive big man ever, and people took and ran with that. I have Jokic number 5, and I agree with a lot of what Carson said. Jokic is so valuable in the sense that, like, him just being on the court. I said this on one of our shows a couple weeks back, but I was like, you could put 4 YMCA hoopers around Jokic, and they're going to find a way to win 40 games, right? Like, you can put us 4 on the pod, put us next to Jokic, we're going to win 40 games somehow. I don't know how.
You cut into the basket efficiently.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got some size.
We got to lock in and play defense, and we got to hit some open threes, right? Jokic's amplification is so great, and his gravity is so great. And I agree with you. I think he is the best offensive player ever. But when I look at two-way value, there are 2 guys that I think had comparable floor raising and ceiling raising post-2000. And those guys to me are Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett. And those are the two bigs that I would have above Jokic because of the two-way gap. And I get it. Jokic is so great offensively that I think you can make an argument over those guys, but I wouldn't, right? KG is trotting out top 6 offenses every year at his peak and does not have great personnel around him. Tim Duncan is elevating guys in his rosters. His rosters is, we got removed from like the late 90s to the early 2000s or better. I think Duncan and Garnett's two-way value surpass Jokic's offensive supremacy, but I understand the argument, but I like two-way guys, and that's why Duncan and KG are above him to me.
Go ahead.
Something that I really find impressive with Jokic is just the way you can rely on his post-up scoring in late games, whether it's his touch around the rim, his touch between 0 to 6 feet, the way he's able to find open guys, the way he's able to get guys open. The three-point shooting has come back this season, the way he's able to run off curls, be a pick-and-roll ball handler and roll man, make decisions out of the short roll, make decisions with his back to the basket. He's an extremely effective offensive rebounder, and he's been able to keep the ball over top of his head and go back up in those situations. So his offensive peak is very, very high. I have him number 3 on this list as well. So yeah, I have him number 3. Yeah, 100%.
Cook, John. Cook.
I have him number 3.
Interesting.
It's interesting, Logan, to me that you said the KG thing, because I love KG. I mean, I think that the impact numbers, again, I'm talking about Jokic. He's reaching territory that KG set first, right? I mean, these are two of the most impactful players if we look at on-off. Honestly, the two most impactful that we've seen. You throw Steph up there, you throw LeBron up there. What's interesting to me about that is the difference in playoff performance, right? I think in 2023, Jokic had the single greatest offensive postseason we've ever seen, and KG was in brutal offensive circumstances in Minnesota. I don't think there's any denying that. At the same time, he really, really struggled to be an efficient offensive number one, to be a productive number one by the standards of a dude who is going to lead you to a deep playoff run. And I certainly don't think his situation was helping. I also think that is a limitation he has that nobody else who we're going to talk about in my top 5 peaks had, right? Even compared to Duncan, I think Duncan scaled significantly better as a scorer to the playoffs and had the physical advantage, at least as a post hub, right? Where he was just a little bigger, a little stronger, and that made him more effective. KG struggled, man. KG struggled in a lot of those postseasons. And to me, I'm just going to take the guy who can guide me through and lead an all-time offense and give me offensive value like we've never seen.
I understand that. And we've done this a million times talking about, the run with Austin Rivers, with Monte Morris, with Facundo Campazzo, right? Again, Jokic can be around anybody and he's going to do his own thing. Let me ask you this. Do you think Jamal Murray would have been the best playoff performer that Kevin Garnett played with in his entire career?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think that the level that Jamal got to in the bubble and in 2023.
I don't want to go back in circles, but that would be my argument, is just the fact that KG never had that kind of personnel around him and had such a hard job of being elite. I mean, his best year is that 2004 Western Conference Finals run, and his co-stars are, I think, 34-year-old Sam Cassell and 33-year-old Latrell Sprewell. Like they're hellish situations, and I prefer Garnett and Duncan's two-way value. Like, they're going to make me a great defense and a great offense on both sides of the ball. And again, I just value that two-way value more. And KG is such an anomaly in the sense that those teams suck, dude. I mean, that 1 year 2004, right? Like, those teams just sucked. It goes back to what Marz was saying at the top of the episode, man. I think it's really hard to separate these guys from some of their tough situations, and I just think KG was in one of the worst ever.
What's interesting, real quick, and I don't want to hog the mic on this Jokic thing, is that we saw Jokic in one of those situations. Like, I don't think that you can overstate how bad the 2022 Nuggets roster actually was, right? And with Jokic on the floor, just in games that he appeared in, they played at a better than 50 win pace. And when he's on the floor, I mean, they had a better net rating than all the other contenders for MVP, Giannis and Embiid, who had significantly better rosters around them, right? You don't have Jamal Murray or Michael Porter Jr. for that entire season, and you're still an elite offense and elite basketball team with Jokic on the floor. And then on top of that, he has the all-time dominant playoff run that puts them over the top. KG has the floor raising. I don't know that he had that ability as an offensive number one to take you over the top, whereas Jokic is like the best we've ever seen in that regard. So that's why I prefer Jokic.
I mean, I think everyone agrees KG is not as good of an offensive player.
Certainly. I'm
Yeah.
just saying the gap is massive. And I do think as impactful as KG was all around as one of the greatest defensive players ever, you have to be capable of being a good enough number one to win a title, right? Like obviously the offensive gap between Duncan and Jokic is huge too. I think Duncan in several playoff runs showed with bad supporting casts around him, supporting casts that get overrated maybe if you're looking at the early 2000s, he could be that offensive number one to wheel you to a deep playoff run.
Minnesota
and KG didn't ever scale as well.
And Minnesota didn't have a first-round pick from 2001 to 2005. Like
the roster sucks.
I mean,
but look at the Duncan roster in
Joe
2001 and 2002.
Oh no, what is it? Antonio Daniels his best, second best player?
Derek Anderson's his second leading scorer. Antonio Daniels is up there. Like nobody close to all-star caliber in 2002 or 2003. And Duncan is out there putting up an efficient 27 and giving you really good playmaking. And KG didn't do that. So I don't think that they're quite the same when we talk about them as postseason performers and offensive number ones.
Not to derail the conversation, but would you compare Kevin Garnett to a David Robinson?
I think it's a phenomenal comparison. I think he's a better David Robinson. Two of the greatest regular season players ever who had their pitfalls as offensive number ones in the playoffs.
Okay. Just to speak a little bit, I think everything that's been said about Jokic is, I don't think I can add anything new to the conversation, other than the fact that his touch has been a bit worse this year. Just observing. It's probably going to get back to the norm, the same way his 3-point shot is probably going to regress back to the norm. But for now, he's a bum. But defensively, I do think there is more concerns than I think we've brought up. I do think the rim protection is concerning. I do think the way that Denver have to, I'm not going to say hide him within their scheme because he's very active and he's very involved within their scheme. But the way I do think they lack a level of scheme versatility because of Jokic. And I do think that can come back to hurt them against certain offenses. Even that 2022 season you allude to, yes, his impacts was through the roof in the regular season, but I do think a big part of, they were never going to beat the Warriors with that roster. But I do think I think we have to mention that Jokic was attacked religiously in that series defensively. And I do think he's improved since that year. But I do think that's a concern you have to deal with Jokic. And is his offense worth the defensive navigation you have to do with him as a coach? Yes. But I do think when you bring him up next to a Tim Duncan, next to a Kevin Garnett, who I think we're probably going to talk about next, just because it makes sense, I do think that's relevant. I do think obviously Jokic is the best offensive player of the three. But I do think when it comes to a Tim Duncan in particular, I do think you have to do the least amount of work to maximize Tim Duncan. And I do think that's relevant. I do think if you maximize Jokic, you can have an all-time great playoff offense. But I do think you can make a good postseason defense depending on matchups. But I do think you're always going to be susceptible to a bad matchup can break your defense. And I think that's what the Warriors were. Whereas with Tim Duncan, I don't think that really existed. I think you're going to get a baseline level of production, regardless of series, regardless of personnel, where we're going to have a good defense. The offense is probably never going to be elite. You might have a few years where Manu Ginobili's playing really well, and you get to that level. I think 2005 is the year where they had probably a really good postseason offense. But I do think there's just, the floor is higher, I guess is what I'm trying to say, with a Tim Duncan team because of what he does on both ends, because of the he's not a versatile defender, but he could play a vast amount of ways. And the era didn't rely on him to step out on the perimeter as much as it does with Jokic and the rim protection value he provided. So I think that would be the case for Duncan over Jokic. I'm not trying to convince anyone of that. I think Logan's already on my side. I think Carson is already on his side. John D, you've already changed your mind on Giannis earlier, so I'm trying to convince you right now. That's why I'm.
Nah, John's with me.
John, am I making a good case for Duncan? Am I making a good case?
You are making a fantastic case. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just stamped on how reliable the easy offense is with Jokic and how easy it comes in the playoffs and the regular season. And once again, just being able to go to something consistently throughout a stretch, whether it's the offense is struggling or not having the personnel compared to the team you're going against, and just being able to get the best out of a bad situation or maybe the worst situation possible, that Jokic provides with the rim dominance, with the playmaking, with the shooting, and the versatility of offense that he's able to provide. So whatever situation you're going to put Jokic in, I think he's going to give you the best opportunities available for the guys that are next to him to where they can concede and they can contribute to a offense that's sustainable and an offense that can succeed with him. So I would keep Jokic at number 3.
It's a fair argument. I mean, your offense is never going to stall out in the half court with a Jokic ever. They're going to get to what they want. The only thing I want to add on Duncan, one, Carson, I think you made a really good point earlier just about the rosters that Duncan was dealing with early on in his career. Those Spurs teams were not talented, and Duncan comes in. Granted, it's a different era of basketball, right? Duncan finishes 4 years of school because he made a promise to his mom, right, that he was going to do it. He was going to graduate from Wake Forest. Immediately comes in and transforms those teams. And I think he's a little bit underrated offensively. I think some people may look at just like the raw numbers and dude, I think Tim Duncan has like the least sexy game ever. Like it's not sexy, but it's effective, right? Can just go on the low block, kill you with footwork, with touch, with strength, hooks, fadeaways, pull-ups. It's really effective. It's not like the most aesthetically pleasing or anything, but it is really effective. And so to confirm, Carson, so you have Jokic over Tim Duncan as well too?
I mean, these are two of my favorite basketball
players.
Yeah, I know.
Ever.
Duncan was my favorite player my entire childhood. Duncan would be my number 4. I think that he's what is that crazy, Marz?
Duncan was my favorite player. Damn.
Listen, man, I always loved things in players who I felt were underrated, and I was like, look at Tim Duncan, man. Look at what he's been doing my entire life, and I still think that it remains the case that he's underrated. So I do have a number 4. I mean, I think he's a top 3 defender of all time. He led 11 straight top 3 defenses, and that includes a handful of them right after David Robinson retired. And like he was doing this even late in his career. We're talking peak, but even 38-year-old Tim Duncan was anchoring elite defenses. And I do agree that he's underrated offensively, Logan. You look at 2002, 2003 in the playoffs, Duncan gave you 25.5 points, 15 boards, 5 assists, 3.6 blocks per game, on plus 5% relative true shooting, and didn't just lead top 3 defenses both those years, led top 9 offenses both those years without good supporting talent alongside him. In 2001 to 2003, they're 12 points per 100 possessions better with him on the floor over that span. They're averaging 59 wins. That was incredibly impressive with those rosters, what he was doing on both ends, not just defensively. So I love Duncan. Again, I'll just take Jokic's literal GOAT offense. And the defense that I would give for him, Marz, is if you look at the 2023 title run, that was a really, really good defense that was built around Jokic, right? So I'm not going to sit here and say he's a real plus defender. I also think we've seen you can put a really good defense out that is built around Jokic. And if you look at the Warriors series, the personnel around Jokic also wasn't good. And I also think he wasn't the defender that he would become that year. I think that he had to improve in terms of some motor stuff. But yeah, I have Jokic 3, Duncan 4.
I think something that is very underrated Duncan was the way he was able to drive off the catch. I think some of it was pleasing a little bit. The way he was able to put the ball on the floor at times. The mid-range was very, very progressive or very, very impactful for Tim Duncan. The post play. There was points in his career where he thrived off being a help defender. He thrived off being a post defender, being a anchor. And there was years where he was really good on the perimeter as well with the length and the quickness he had on the perimeter. Tim Duncan is really good. Tim Duncan was really good. I have his peak at 2002 to 2004. I think he averaged about 24, 13, maybe 3 blocks as well. He was a +9 net rating for that team. So being able to consistently anchor a top defense in the league, and this isn't just like a top defense in the league. This is some of the best defenses that we've seen, and he's anchoring these defenses, being a post defender, help side rim protector. It's up there, man. It's up there.
Do you also have Duncan at 4?
Yeah.
Okay, like so you're copying Carson. Cool.
No, great man. Great minds think alike. Great minds think alike.
I'm just noticing the same years as LeBron's peak, and then the 2 through 4 is the exact same order.
Great minds.
Yeah, John, I'm about to have to ask you for your number 5 after we get done with Tim Duncan, because I need to make sure you're not just copying.
Okay.
But for me with Tim Duncan, I think you bring up a great point about his ability to drive off the catch. I think people forget that Tim Duncan used to actually be an elite athlete and a great mover. I mean, I think people remember the center Tim Duncan, who was a bit slower, more lumbering. The offensive game wasn't as great, if I'm being honest. But when he was agile, when he was able to get to the rim, and I think we all agree Jokic has better touch, but Tim Duncan, his touch around the basket was amazing. His ability to make those flip shots, those hook shots, it seemed like his shot never had any arc, but it always had a chance of going in, which was very intriguing. And defensively, I don't know if I would have him as the 3rd best defender ever. I think Bill Russell and Hakeem are pretty solidified as the top 2. But I think I go back and forth between the best power forwards ever, between KG and Tim Duncan, peak for peak. I think Tim Duncan in his time was the more valuable defender because of the post defense, because of the pure rim protection. He was the more typical center per se, whereas KG, I think, was more ahead of his time in terms of the switchability, the versatility. But I always battle with myself internally about what I value on the day between those two defensively. But I do think those are number 3 and number 4 defensively of all time. But for me, with Tim Duncan, the thing that I guess today's a day where I'm going to say Tim Duncan over Kevin Garnett. So if we do this show a year from now, I might change my mind. I don't know. But today, I think I'm going with Tim Duncan. I do think it is the playoff translation. I do think it is the more reliable offense. We spoke about his strength, just he was able to carve out easier opportunities for himself than KG ever was capable of. KG was a de facto wing offensively. That's what he was. He was a hybrid wing who took a lot of mid-range jumpers, was a very good passer, was asked to initiate offense way more than he probably should have been, but that comes down to situation again. Whereas Tim Duncan was more of a low post threat, someone who was able to manufacture easy offense for himself, was able to play out the double team easier because of where he was getting double teamed from, and then make those reads, make interior reads, make kickouts for his shooters. And then the Spurs, they never had 2014 ball movement in the early 2000s, but just being able to get the ball to the open man off Tim Duncan's initial advantage creation was extremely valuable. Now, they never had elite playoff offenses. I think they had a few years where they were good in the postseason offensively, but when you're having some of the best defenses of all time, I think that's good enough to lead to success, as proven by the amount of success they had. So I would go with Tim Duncan above KG. That's where I'm at with it. But I do think it's a closer conversation than I think people are willing to have, in large part because of the amount of success they both had in their peaks. But I am going to edge slightly towards Tim Duncan in that regard. And do I think they're both better than Jokic? I don't know, if I'm being honest. I'm a grade A fence sitter. I don't know. But for the sake of conversation today, I'm gonna say if I had to rank them 1 through 3 today, I would say Jokic, Duncan, KG. That's the order I would go with.
I love it.
So yes, there you go, Tim Duncan. So I've been accused of being a Tim Duncan hater in my day. I think it's because of all the KG propaganda I push. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't think I hate Tim Duncan. I think he's really good. I just think KG's closer than people give him credit for. But enough about that boring post-up merchant. Let's talk about Kevin Garnett. I gave my spiel on him. John D, where do you have Kevin Garnett?
If I were to rank Kevin Garnett right now, I would say 7, maybe 6 to 9 around that range. I'm gonna make it 7 to 9. I'm gonna make it 7 to 9. I wouldn't have him 5 or 6, but I would have him around 7 and 9. I think the defensive peak was phenomenal. He was extremely athletic. He was good in transition. He was good on the perimeter. He had a big man type of build when we talk about height and wingspan, which gave him an edge to block shots. And we've talked about this earlier where we've seen Kevin Garnett try to be a number 1 offensively, and that's what really holding him back in the playoffs. But having that high of a defensive peak where he's able to fly around the perimeter, block shots, get steals, play passing lanes, and then be very effective in transition, I would still have Kevin Garnett at top 10.
KG or Giannis?
KG or Giannis? Peak for peak, I would have Giannis. Peak for peak, I would have Giannis.
I'm with you, John.
Peak for peak, I would have Giannis.
Damn.
I'm with you. To me, the difference.
Of course, you guys are on the same side again.
Oh, yeah. We talked before the show. We have the exact same list. I agree. And I think that there's no question that KG is the greater regular season floor raiser, although they're both amazing there. But I would take KG there. To me, the difference is, again, Giannis is far from a perfect offensive number 1, right? We've talked compared to a lot of these other guys. He's below the pack. But nevertheless, we saw him reach an ability to will you offensively just with that unbelievable downhill pressure and his improved playmaking in 2021 and in 2022 to produce at a level that we didn't see from KG ever in terms of volume or efficiency in the playoffs. Because as you mentioned, Marz, like it was a tough shot diet that he lived off of. It was a lot of the mid-range looks. He was never able to just physically exert himself and dominate a game offensively with that raw power in the way that Giannis can't. So I think it's close between the two of them, but that's why I go Giannis.
we
Logan, please be
basically
on my
just spoke
side.
at the same time. So
Yeah.
Logan, please be on my side, please.
No, I mean, I've got KG higher than KG's top 5. I've got him over Jokic as well. I mean, my top 5 is LeBron, Shaq, Tim, KG, and then Jokic. And it's close. I hate going back to the personnel argument with KG, man. But, I mean, these teams are just so comically bad. He took Trenton Hassel and Irvin Johnson, not Magic, Irvin Johnson to the Western Conference Finals in 04, man.
Okay. Well, he had Sam Cassell and Sprewell that year.
Sam
We're not
Cassell
gonna act
got
like those
hurt.
are-
Sam Cassell got hurt.
He missed a
He's
couple
balling,
games.
though.
He missed a couple games. But I just
Yeah,
think
he was
that personnel was so bad. And I agree with you guys. It's like, yeah, man, if KG took, if he took 2 steps behind the line, his shots are way more valuable. I just think you're getting a really good offensive player. I think he's a better defender than Giannis. I think I would take it as peak. I think they're comparable defensive playmakers, but I think KG's better. And then again, man, it's just like he didn't have the luxury or the attention or anybody to take the load heavily off him for a long time. And then when we see KG finally get that help in 2008, and that's an all-time great team. The 2008 Celtics are just loaded with Rondo setting the table for everybody, with Ray Allen, with Pierce. Those teams are loaded, right? KG doesn't have to do nearly as much offensively. They finally get it done. I think KG's under.
That's kind of the thing with KG to me, Logan, not to cut you off, because that's not peak KG, right? Obviously, I think peak KG, we're talking 2003, 2004, 2002. But that to me was the ideal offensive role for KG. It was to be an offensive number 2, certainly your best player overall. But if you were going to win a title, I think he had to be your offensive number 2. And that's what he gets in Boston, where you could, he's definitely the number 2. I mean, he's producing with more volume than Ray Allen, but he's part of that 3-headed monster. And that's just a limitation that I don't think Giannis has. Giannis is flawed offensively. Giannis could will you there as a number 1. Wasn't going to be as pretty, wasn't going to be as easy, but you're getting the elite defensive impact, not at KG's level, and then a dude who can be your offensive number 1 on a title.
I am admittedly biased. Like, I do not like watching Giannis play, so maybe I am biased, but
I think I don't think I agree. I mean, this Giannis now, different conversation, but the defensive fallout. I think what's happening. I think we're conflating the outcome with like actually how good Giannis is offensively. Giannis was the offensive number 1 in Milwaukee, but they didn't win because of what he was doing offensive. They weren't a good offensive team.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
They were a great postseason defense
that
won. It's like saying Chauncey Billups was an offensive number 1 on a championship team. That's how
I'm
viewing
no.
it.
It's not like that though.
That's how I meant. Like they were a plus 0.5 relative offense in the postseason.
Well, and Giannis also shredded.
He was the best offensive player on a championship team, but that was not a championship level offense. So
Marz, that is insane to say though. Look at what he did against Boston. Look at what he did in the 2021 finals. Those are dominant offensive performances. They weren't a great team offense.
I mean, he went up
and a lot of that was the surrounding personnel.
He went up against Sharman Ultrasoft DeAndre Ayton though, man. I mean, come on.
I'm not here. DeAndre Ayton is, for all intents and purposes, a bum. But
KG never had an offensive postseason like 2021 or 2022, Giannis. Individually.
I agree. But when I hear offensive number 1, offensive number 2, like the way I hear it, the way I interpret that is, can you lead elite offense as the number 1 offensive option? And I don't think Giannis has shown the ability to do that. So I guess we're interpreting the term differently.
I'm saying that he is more capable, right? Okay, if you structure a team around both these guys at their peaks, your foundation is probably going to be an elite defense, right? And it's going to be how much floor raising can these guys do for you offensively? And I just think that Giannis is better at that. And I think that he didn't have to produce elite team offense because the standard offensively was, hey, can we be good enough to ride our defense to a title? And Giannis, can you carry us enough offensively? And he did it. And I think because of his physical imposition on the game, he was capable of doing that in a way that KG wasn't. And I think we saw that in 2021 and 2022. He didn't win the title, but he was amazing. I mean, I know the efficiency isn't great, but that Boston series was amazing individually from Giannis.
It's a -5 postseason offense. But
dude,
I think,
oh my God, that was the worst offensive situation against an elite defense.
Yeah, but I mean, that's accounting for how good Boston was as a defense. They still underperformed. I just think my concern is if KG was magically able, if Sam Cassell stays healthy, and maybe they beat the Lakers in 04, and then they play against the Pistons in the finals, win or lose, for the sake of argument, let's say they lose. But then now KG gets that Timberwolves team to the finals, competes with the Pistons. And I feel like the opinion of KG being able to lead a team as an offensive number one changes solely because they got over the hump of getting to the final. Like, the Timberwolves were never going to be an elite postseason offense with KG, in part because of his flaws, but in part because of personnel. I don't think the peak of Giannis was ever going to lead to elite postseason offense, in part because of personnel, but also in part because of his flaws. I just think the difference is the Bucks got over the hump and the Timberwolves didn't. That's where I'm
the difference
disconnected.
Is that Giannis averaged 30 plus 12 and 6 on really good efficiency, and KG averaged like 21 on bad efficiency. That to me is the difference.
In what
and
series?
Also the 2022
in what series?
At their respective playoff peaks. If we're comparing 21, 22 Giannis to KG throughout his Minnesota
I don't
prime.
think KG was down at 21. I mean, that seems real. I think he was what, like 24, 25?
No, I mean in 2004 he averaged 24, but there's several years.
I mean,
around
in the playoffs from 2002 to 04, which is for all intents and purposes KG's peak, he was averaging 25, 15, and 5.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going a little. That's fair. I was going with more of a range throughout his time as the guy in Minnesota, where he's 23 a night on 51%.
I kind of tend to
if you
agree
look
with
at his peak, 25, 15, and 5 in a slower paced era, like 30 points in 2020 is not the same as 30 points in 2003. So like KG gets 25, 15, and 5.
But the efficiency's still rough.
I agree. I agree, and that's because of shot diet and things like that.
Yeah.
But then I would adamantly argue that KG's situation was much worse. I would be very, very adamant.
It was worse.
With that case.
It was worse. But I think you're understating how insane what Giannis did in 2022 was. Pat Connaughton was his third leading scorer in that series. The Bucks shot 28% from deep around him. He was creating every shot for that offense without Middleton against an elite defense, the best defense in the league. And he's giving you 33, 15, and 7, 34, 15, and 7. I just don't think that KG could individually will you. Well, because everybody around.
I agree. I'm
Giannis
just saying
isn't an
that because
all-time
you pointed out
player,
KG's inefficiency. Neither of them are all-time offensive players.
Certainly. And that's fair. Giannis's efficiency in that series was not great. But we've seen Giannis reach heights of efficiency that far surpass what we've seen from KG in the regular season and playoffs offensively. 2021 being a prime example.
Because he's able to manufacture easier shots. So it's the Tim
Duncan
situation. But then I agree. I'm not arguing that KG is a better offensive player than Giannis. I guess my disagreement is that the gap is large enough to offset what I think is a clear defensive gap. And I think we're saying that because of the fact that I get it's important to do it on the biggest stage and get to the finals and that 50-point game with some crazy unsustainable free throw shooting. But anyway, I understand that. But when we talk about being an offensive number one, I think it's relevant to point out that winning a championship doesn't mean you can be the offensive number one on a championship team, even if you are. But if a team wins on the strength of its defense, like the Bucks, like the 04 Pistons, like the Timberwolves would have done last year if they won a championship, I'm not going to then say Anthony Edwards can be the offensive number one on a championship team, just with all his flaws that I'm acknowledging, because of the fact that they got it done and ultimately won a championship.
I get what you're saying.
I guess my disagreement is.
I get what you're saying. So maybe you don't need to look at it through those terms. My point is Giannis was able to exert himself physically and with a volume offensively to surpass what KG could do offensively when asked to take that leading role. So maybe don't view it as a championship caliber number one. Maybe just view it as an offensive player, one to the next. I think that Giannis was more capable of carrying that load, and that's why I prefer him. And I don't think it's crazy to have KG higher than Giannis at all. I think these dudes are super close all time. But I do think Giannis is clearly better in that way, just as KG is clearly better defensively. I just prefer the dude who I think can carry the heavier offensive load, the better offensive player. That to me offsets the difference, especially in the playoffs.
So you're always going to lean offense over defense in these individual comparisons?
No, not always. Well, I think if players are in all ways equivalent, and I think that Giannis and KG are incredibly close as all-around basketball players, then I lean on offense because I think at the end of the day, you have to generate a great shot to win. But no, it's far from an all or nothing thing. I mean, it's super circumstantial, right? And these are two really, really close basketball players all time.
Okay, so I wanna make sure I'm not. So you said you had Giannis at 6. So do you have
Yeah.
KG at 7?
I'm very caught between KG at 7 and 8.
Oh, okay. I'm curious to see where you're going with that. I also want to just make sure I've got everyone else's list down so far. So, John, you have LeBron, Shaq, Jokic, Duncan. That's your top 4.
Mhm.
And then you have Giannis at 7 or 8.
Yeah, I would say 7.
Okay, so you got Giannis at 7 and then KG 8
Yeah.
with Kobe at 6.
Yep.
Okay. And then Logan, you've got LeBron, Shaq, Duncan, KG, and Jokic as your top 5.
Correct.
With Giannis at 7 and Kobe at 8.
Correct.
Okay, so we're getting there. We're filling out the top 10 ever so slightly. I want to read a couple more super chats because some have come in. We've got a $50 super chat, by the way. So shout out to Teddy Hart. He's loving the show. Terry with 2 dads said the idea of Super Jason Kidd turning into Phoenix Barkley is hilarious. In another alternate universe where MJ never returned, how do you think Scotty's career would have played out?
I think he would have led a lot of teams to solid first and second round playoff exits. I just don't.
I'm trying to think if you could sneak a conference finals or finals appearance in there. I don't think they get over the Pacers.
Yeah. I mean, even when Scotty was a guy, didn't Phil Jackson drop to play for Kukoc a game? I just don't think Scotty was that level of offensive player that could have led you to. Scotty's like the best number 2
exactly
that you could ask for.
2. Yeah, he's a perfect number 2.
Yeah, I think he would have been looked at maybe slightly less favorably. I'm not sure though. NP13 with an interesting question regarding Duncan. He said, but wasn't it glaring that Duncan was getting killed in drop against the Lakers because he benefits from an era's basketball style? It shouldn't really be counted as something attributed to Duncan. I think the Duncan that got killed in drop, we're looking post knee injuries, post foot injuries, 06, 07, 08. I think before that, his mobility was never a problem on defense and he could step up on ball screens. I think the non-peak version of Duncan did have those concerns defensively where he was more of a pure rim protector. And I do think that's relevant. But I also think when you're in an era that doesn't rely as much on ball screens and isn't as much of a pull-up jump shooting league, it's not as much of a detriment, which is why I think a lot of the great defensive players of 25 years ago wouldn't look as good in today's game, but I'm not going to hold that against them because they're not playing in today's game. So I think Tim Duncan was the perfect style of defender for his time, and I think that's why he was probably the best defender of his time, and I'm not going to error tax him, I guess, for that. I think I answered the question. Anyone have anything to add?
No, I think that's the right way to look at it. It's like being like, oh, well, Bill Russell couldn't play today because he couldn't shoot threes or something nonsensical. It's like that. We're going to judge Bill Russell in the era that he played in, and he had the most conducive and best skill set to winning in that era, right? We're not going to hold that against him. I think you have to judge guys respective of their era, right? Like the game is just naturally, the guys are more athletic, the guys are bigger, the guys are more skilled nowadays. I think that's obvious, but you got to judge them within their respective eras. So I think the era tax is a good way to put it.
Yeah, shout out to the era tax. Teddy Hart said, YouTube Crash Bar sends in a super chat, we'll send it again. And then he tapped in with a $50 one. So shout out to Teddy Hart, showing love to the show. All it took was getting Nerd Session here, and people want to start giving me money. It's great. He said, if a player wants to become the GOAT, what position gives them the best shot? In my opinion, power forward is the only realistic path. So I think he means the GOAT at that position. Tim Duncan is the only positional GOAT that the masses would accept someone surpassing. Magic / Curry, MJ, LeBron, and Kareem / Shaq / Jokic is non-passable. Yeah, I think power forward is probably, it feels weird. No, I think point guard is the easiest spot to get to. If I'm being honest, I think point guard is probably the easiest spot to get to.
I also think if we look at today's landscape, I mean, who are the truly great players? We have like our true center bigs. We have our wings. We have our primary ball handlers who are basically all point guards now. And there's a ton of those guys, right? Because we count Luka and SGA and all those guys. And like, yeah, you have your bigger wings, so you call power forward. But I think I might be with you, Marz. I mean, I think it's point guard or power forward. I just think it's more likely we see a monumentally great point guard who can surpass a Magic or a Steph than it is we see a monumentally great power forward, just because like not as many of the great players today, or I guess, right now, LeBron, Tatum, KD, these guys are considered power forwards, but I don't know.
Yeah,
They're definitely not true power forwards in the older sense.
I think the longevity is what made that easier decision for me. Magic's got about 13-ish years. Steph's got around the same. If you're being generous, it's more like 10 or 11. Tim Duncan's got 19 years of elite level impact. So I think just from that standpoint alone, I think if you have a point guard who comes into the league, maybe it's Luka Doncic. Maybe he goes on a tear for the next 10 years and it's like, oh, well, he's already got 6 All-NBA first teams plus an extra 10 years just on a longevity standpoint alone. He might be able to make up that gap. So I do think point guard is probably the easiest, but I think I need to make it abundantly clear before someone says it's easy to pass Magic. None of these players are easy to get by. This is going to take a ton of work and a ton of longevity and a ton of impact to get into these levels of conversation. But I do think if one was the most attainable, it would be the point guard position. So
you guys wouldn't say center. I don't know. I feel like center would be the choice just because Wemby.
Center's the most loaded, though. It's the most loaded position.
Center is the most.
Oh, are you saying in terms of Wemby is already in the league and he's like
my argument would be just because Wemby exists, but the just potential impact I think you can have at the center position is just greater than all over positions, just because you can anchor a defense and be the guy that is solely responsible for making a defense great while having elite offensive impact. I get that's not the question, right? Because you factor in who's the best at their respective, because I think you guys make great points. It is probably point guard with, the lowest level to surpass, but I would just say center just because of the potential impact you could have on both sides of the ball.
I think you make a good point, because when I first read the super chat, I think I read it wrong. I think I said the way I read it was, what position could you play to make the best GOAT argument? In meaning like the best player of all time. So I thought center because of what you said, being able to be such a high level impact defender, because you are going to be anchoring a defense. And then if you are giving a consistent all NBA or MVP case at that position, you're going to be looked at as one of the greatest two-way players of all time. So I think you have the opportunity in impacting both sides of the floor consistently year in and year out to where you could become the GOAT in that way. But positional GOAT, I do think point guard has a very strong case. I think you can say Magic Johnson and Steph Curry were extremely great. They were extremely valuable. I do think they do have some flaws that you can point at, to where if you get a really good stretch from these extremely talented point guards that we have coming into the NBA, the point guards that we have now, the scoring jump that we have, the scoring jump that we have gotten from point guards in recent years, I think point guard could be the easiest part to attack.
Teddy Hart saying you guys interpreted it correctly, so I'm wrong. What position would you have to play to become the GOAT? Yeah, the bigger you are, the better chance you have. That's in my opinion. So yeah, Wemby, there you go. 7'4", be as big as possible, as impactful as possible. If that's the interpretation, then I do think it's center. So appreciate you, Teddy Hart, for showing a lot of love to the stream.
Yes,
but back to the top 10. We've got 7 spots down. We've got a couple people who haven't finished their top 5. So I'm gonna just go straight to Carson. Who do you have at number 5?
Number 5 for me is Steph. I just think that Steph is one of those tier 1 offensive players, right? I do prefer Jokic. I think that there is more of an ability to just literally get whatever he wants at will with that scoring, passing combo at his size, with his strength out of the post specifically. But I also think that Steph is a one-of-a-kind offensive player that we've ever seen. And I just think the efficiency is overwhelming. I think the impact on team offense is overwhelming. And he's sustained it for a long time, obviously, now. And I actually think that when you consider his peak is interesting, because I think that most people would say 2016, that's certainly when he's the most ahead of the curve, right? And that's when he has his unanimous MVP and his greatest statistical regular season. I think that probably just in a vacuum, though, 2021 Steph is the best he was as a player, because he was stronger, because I do think he was an even greater on-ball scorer. But whichever version you take, I mean, I would still have him in that number 5 spot either way. We talk about the guys who are the GOATs in terms of on-off, and KG is there, Jokic is there, but also Steph is there. His teams are like 11 points per 100 possessions better with him on the floor over the years. I think that he makes everybody around him a significantly better basketball player, and I'm good with limited defensive impact. That's another thing, actually, for 2021 Steph, 2022 Steph. I think he was certainly a better defensive player, along with that added strength and a little bit more maturity. But I'm just going to take a GOAT level offensive player here. I think that we've seen that impact year after year, and we've never seen anybody do it in the way he does with that sort of off-ball value and gravity.
John, you better not tell me you have Steph at 5.
See, because I was praying he was going to say someone different. I'm really trying to beat these allegations.
We're locked in, bro. We're locked in. I'm
really trying to beat these allegations, but this Steph was extremely efficient. I had his peak at 2016 to 2018. Over those spans, Steph was able to provide a high level of offense for guys, no matter who was around him. And one thing that Steph always created was easy shots for the players around him. And throughout those seasons, they were number 5th in paint touches in 15-16, number 1 in paint touches in 16-17, and number 2 in paint touches in 17-18. And they were also top 5 transition teams every year that I mentioned of his peak. So now you have somebody who's extremely valuable off ball. His gravity is so valuable. The second he passes half court, he's great off ball. He's great downhill. He can shoot off the dribble. And I don't think anybody has a more confidence shattering shot than Steph Curry. Like, let's say your team's down 7 and Steph is losing the ball around half court. He just picks it up, turns around and shoots. It's nothing, but you want to turn the TV off. You really want to turn the TV off after he makes shots like those. Like, those shots are detrimental and they're world shattering. He's broken my heart off of those type of shots multiple times, but Steph is just a phenomenal player. His playmaking is top tier. His shooting is always going to be top tier. He's going to be the greatest shooter of all time. I don't think we're going to see another shooter like Steph for a very long time. So the way he's going to be able to provide a high level offense for a very long time, or he has been able to do it for a very long time, that's what gives me the edge. Can you make offense easy for yourself and easy for others? That's the type of peak that I would look at for some of these players that I have on this list. And Steph Curry was elite at it.
I mean, I think that is the key argument for Steph, is that in any era surrounded by any player, you can put Steph and he is going to make great offenses happen. And I know a lot of people try to denigrate Steph's peak because, Kevin Durant comes to town and those are super teams. They're freaking loaded top to bottom. The one thing that I always point to with Steph is what everybody else does, is that he won before KD. And he won post KD, and he was the guy on offense. And you mentioned the gravity. Nobody's had it better. The one thing I want to add about Steph versus some of these other all-timers, the reason that I have Jokic and Steph below my top 4 is because of the two-way value. I want guys that are valuable on both sides of the floor. But again, that can outweigh it if you are one of the all-time GOAT offensive players. That's why Jokic and Steph are here. The reason I would have Jokic above Steph is just because I think Jokic is a more unstoppable scorer and he just can get to his looks easier, right? He's so strong. He can go on the low block and just manufacture an easy look, and he's either going to draw a double team. It's little stuff like that. That's why I would have Jokic above Steph, but Steph's at number 6 for me. So, Marz, I don't know if you have like Steph way lower on this list or how you're feeling, but Steph is 6 for me.
Outside of LeBron and Shaq, I haven't said where I have anyone. I don't know if anyone's the 2 non-controversial ones I've said, oh yeah, I got LeBron and Shaq 1 and 2. Everything else I've just let you guys go. But I did say I have Tim Duncan over KG, so there's that. But I never said where exactly they are. But I think everything you guys said about Steph is true. I think 2019 I feel is a bit tough that's being left out here. I think 2019 Steph was really, really good.
Yeah.
I think if you're ranking relative to era, which I think you always have to do, I think you have to say 2016 because of how far ahead of the league he was. This was a league that was still exclusively playing drop coverage and was just allowing Steph to walk in to pull up threes out of pick and roll. Whereas you get 2021 where teams are blitzing Steph and now he's having to work harder to create his own shot, which made him the better overall player in terms of in a vacuum. But just based on how the league was around that time, having typical power forwards still playing where they couldn't move their feet on the outside, that's what made Steph and Draymond so dangerous and all of those things. So I think you have to say 2016. I want to say he led the league in scoring and efficiency. I'm pretty sure he's the only person who's ever done that. I don't know if anyone's even come close to that. Maybe Jokic, maybe a Charles Barkley season. But I think not a concern. I'm gonna once again, just raising a question. I like playing devil's advocate around here. Does the efficiency drop off from Steph when Draymond Green isn't on the floor cause any concern for you guys? Is that interesting to you? Is it just variance? Is it noise in terms of smaller sample size? Or do you think there's something to it that Steph is not reliant on Draymond Green, but definitely looks a lot better when Draymond Green is out there?
To me, it's not significant because if you look at the Warriors' success, I mean, they still win 65% of their games when Steph plays and Draymond doesn't over a decade. And they did the same thing without Clay. And they were 27-4 over 3 years without KD in the regular season when he was on the team. They were 27-4 when Steph played and he didn't. So, like, I just think the individual efficiency, you may see a bit of a drop, but overall, I think Steph has proven himself to be an incredible offensive engine, an incredible team engine. If you take any one of these key pieces around him out of the equation. And another thing that I think is a big strength of his, just because you mentioned 2019, that brought it to my mind, is the playoff performance and how his playoff scoring volume and efficiency. I mean, he's 27 a night on plus 5% true shooting. So I think the Warriors offense has always been designed in a way where you really just need one dude who can be that facilitator, right? Who can be your de facto point guard in terms of bringing the ball up the court and executing these actions, or who can execute the split actions that Draymond does out of the post. I love Draymond, but I don't think he's a special offensive player in that regard. Like, I do think it's a great skill that he has, his playmaking, but if they had to, they could find somebody to supplement that offensively. And Steph maybe just needs somebody in that rough mold to be his most effective because he is so great away from the ball. But again, I think we've seen the results are outstanding if you take any of these key pieces away. So I don't view that as a knock. Really, my only concern with Steph would be some of the strength stuff in 2016 on both ends where he could get hunted defensively and he didn't hold up as well offensively in the playoffs. He was hurt with the ankle, but also really physical defense was a bit of a problem. But I just think the impact, the offensive greatness, it's too overwhelming for me to have him outside my top 5.
I think that Draymond deficiency stuff wasn't really a concern of mine. I was just curious what you guys' thoughts was on that. I guess my concern with Steph, or what gives me a bit more hesitation, is you kind of alluded to it, but that Steph's impact, in order to be maximized, relies on someone else making the reads. Whereas I think a Jokic, for example, or a LeBron,
right,
they don't require someone else to make the read. Steph creates the advantages just as well as anyone, maybe better than anyone. But the fact that I think more often than not, when Steph gets blitzed in pick and roll, he's having to make that pocket pass to Draymond. Whereas the bigger ball handlers, the Lukas, the LeBrons, when they get blitzed in pick and roll, they can make that read. They can make that read to the corner more consistently. They can play off that advantage with their own ability more so than Steph can. I think that makes them slightly better in that regard. And then in terms of just his off-ball gravity, what makes off-ball gravity so dangerous is you have another passer who can play off of that, which is what I think, I guess, I don't know if it holds him back. I think it's just different, and I don't know how to quantify different. But I also don't think Draymond was as replaceable offensively, especially at that time. I don't know who else in the league could have done what Draymond did. Defense notwithstanding, I think we understand what he brought defensively, and I'd like to believe everyone up here is of the belief that Draymond was the second most impactful Warrior.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
So there's no Klay Thompson liars here. Okay, that's good to know. But offensively, I don't know if anyone in the league at that 2016, 2017 time could have done what Draymond did, unless I'm neglecting to think of someone. But is there anyone you guys can think of?
That's an interesting point at that moment in time, because I think we've seen more growth from these playmaking forwards off the short roll and all the stuff that Draymond has excelled at forever. But I do think he was ahead of the curve there as well. So I don't in any way want to diminish what Draymond has meant on both sides of the ball. I mean, I couldn't be higher on Draymond Green, but I think you hit on it, Marz. I mean, that's why I prefer a Jokic to Steph offensively. There is just that ability to yourself, regardless of any circumstance, regardless of any matchup, get exactly what you want. Whereas Steph is an amazing ceiling raiser, because if you put great decision makers and great offensive talents around him, he creates the advantage and they can make the most of it. But like you say, it still requires somebody else to make the most of the advantage, which is a great formula for great offense, but requires a little bit more help.
Yeah, no, that was my, I guess, biggest concern. But you guys are pretty much all on the same boat with Steph in terms of 5, 5, and 6. So just to recap, we've got, I don't even need to read Carson and John D's. They're the same top 5s. We've got LeBron, Shaq, Jokic, Duncan, and Steph as 2 top 5s. And then Logan is going against the grain, I guess, with LeBron, Shaq, Duncan, KG, and Jokic as his top 5. But what's left is we have 2 spots remaining. I don't know who they're going to be, but there's one player I have to ask about, and that's Kevin Durant.
I would have. Go ahead.
Yeah, John D says he has Kevin Durant. So where would you have Kevin Durant, John?
I would have him at 6. I would have him at 6 or 6 or 7. I would have him at 6 or 7 in that ballpark.
Above or below Giannis?
I would have him above Giannis. I would have him above Giannis.
Interesting. Okay, I feel like you're straying away from Carson a little bit here, which is, I think that's great. So go ahead.
At this point, I do too. Now to beat the allegations. Kevin Durant, I think, just provided a level of offense where, and when I talk about his peak, a lot of people go back to his MVP years in OKC, where he was a 4-time scoring title winner, which only I think three other players in NBA history did that, which was Jordan, Gervin, and I think Wilt. But I think Kevin Durant's peak was in Golden State. I think he was the better player in Golden State, whether it was the playmaking, the defense, the way he was able to create shots. He was always extremely efficient out of the mid-range. The off-ball got a lot better. The post play, passing out of the post, and being a help side rim protector on defense, showing those signs to be an perimeter defender at times in stretches. I just think he played a lot better basketball in Golden State. So I would say that was his peak. Throughout those times, he shot 48% from 16 feet to 3-point percentage, and then 40% from 3 on top of shooting 50% from 10 to 16 feet. Extremely efficient. To the pull-up shooting, the pull-up mid-range shooting. He averaged 35 points on 50, 40, 90 in the finals. Like KD, and I'm one of those guys who grew up around the time when he went to the Warriors. One of my biggest regrets as a basketball fan is hating on him throughout that run, because it was really hard to do it. But the level of efficiency that he was able to uphold and still upholds, the way he was able to get better as a playmaker, get better as a defender, and also add on top of his shot selection, his game always contributes to high level offense no matter where he goes. It's portable, it's very efficient, very high volume. I have to have him at number 6. I have to have him at number 6 or 7. 6 or 7.
I think you're right in the fact that his peak was in Golden State, and it's ironic too, because I think that KD got better as a playmaker. His best version of a playmaker was after that. I think the best version of KD as a defender was after that too. I think he's improved in those areas after his peak.
You don't think his defensive peak was with the Warriors 2017? I mean,
it might be just because of his motor and the offensive load that he had to pull, right? He can just exert himself more on that end because he's got so many guys around him. I would probably
say, it was also pre-Achilles.
Yeah, maybe that is the best defense, but I think he's gotten better as a playmaker. And what he was doing, I think that's the greatest basketball ever played. Those Warriors teams, that is the greatest team ever assembled. It's the greatest ball ever played. But I think the one thing I disagree with you, John, is that I do hold it against him, and I'm okay with hating on KD for it. I have KD lower. I mean, I'm sorry. It's the most Marz, can I curse on here? Can I say a dirty word?
Say what you want.
It's the most pussy move in basketball history. It is. I don't care about the salary cap spiking. I remember, and I guarantee you guys too, I know exactly where I was when that moment happened because it blew my freaking mind. I was leaving all-star baseball practice, heading home with my mom, and my boy Demarius came up to me in the car and said, "Yo, Logan, KD's going to the Warriors." And I said,
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. It took me like an hour or two to really believe it.
I said, bullshit. I said, that's not happening. That's illegal. And as much fun as it was to watch as just a basketball fan and the beauty of it, I still to this day hold it against Kevin Durant and his legacy. And maybe I shouldn't, because maybe I'd have his peak higher on this list. I still hold it against him to this day that he didn't. And just the circumstances, the fact that they were one game, they hit a 3-1 lead against Golden State.
They come back when you think about them again.
I don't know. I hold it against KD, and that's why he's a little bit lower in my top 10 than where you have him, John. And maybe that's irrational, but I don't care. I'm going to hold that grudge against KD for the entirety of his career.
So where do you have him?
I got him at 10.
Wow.
Damn, because of free agency? Oh god, damn.
This is what's hard with
that's tough.
KD.
Yeah.
I feel like when you're doing an all-time ranking, like looking at an entire career, I try to view that stuff as much in terms of how great was the player in a vacuum, but also it's like to some extent what you achieved does matter. And like KD is the best player ever who did not, as a clear number one, lead a team to a title. But when we're just talking about peak, like that to me is really about your ability at your absolute best. And that's where I think, I mean, I'm with you, John. I would take Golden State KD. I think it's a conversation because when you look at like 2014 KD, when he had improved as a playmaker, the athleticism, the rim pressure was on a different level. And he was empowered to do stuff defensively that like would have been harder for him in OKC, right? In a different system with a different level of an offensive burden on him. And he was playing in the best offensive situation possible in Golden State. But I still feel like that's when he was the most mature, complete version of himself and still had athleticism that he hasn't had since his Achilles injury. So I have him at number 7, man. I have him just barely above KG, which is hard. I think KG is the more impactful regular season player. I think KD is the better playoff performer, though. And I understand that, like, yeah, he didn't will a team there as the clear number one to a title, but it's just impossible for me to say that he couldn't have when you're looking at his peak ability. And like 2017 to 2019, dude, 30 a night, 37 and 5 on 64% true shooting. It was some of the most incredible playoff scoring that I've seen. Like, I think particularly the 2019 versus the Clippers, that was one of the best series that I've seen from a scorer in the playoffs. And he just made it look routine. I think he's the second best scorer ever after only Michael Jordan. And I also totally agree with your point, John, about the portability, the versatility. That is A++ on offense. It's also really impressive defensively. And I think that we saw that in Golden State. So I'm just going to take that sort of all-time top 2 scoring, volume and efficiency and versatility on and off ball, all 3 levels, off the charts, with plus playmaking and with real plus defense at his prime. He's one of the greatest basketball players ever, whether you like what he did or not. Like, that was all-time great impact. So I have him at number 7.
Before I go on my spiel about KD, I just got to ask John, KD or Kobe?
Peak for peak, I'm going to go KD. I'm going to go KD. Yes, I am. And Kobe's my favorite player, but I gotta go KD. His offense was so much easier for himself than Kobe's was. Just being able to be just the physical gifts. Just the physical gifts alone made offense easier for KD. So peak for peak, I gotta go KD.
Interesting. Okay. And then now for me on Kevin Durant, I think I similar to LeBron in the terms of I don't know when I consider KD's peak to be. Sometimes I say it's 2014 through 2017. And then other times I just consider it the Golden State tenure. The issue with 2014 through 2016 is 2015 he didn't play. So sticking to my philosophy of consecutive years, I go with the Golden State tenure ultimately. I probably go 16 through 18, maybe 16 through 19. Postseason injury kind of hurt that a little bit. But I think Kevin Durant at that time is one of the best scorers ever. I don't know where he would rank in the pantheon of scorers, if I'm being honest. But in terms of versatility, I do think he's the most versatile scorer of all time in terms of being able to play on and off ball, being able to score from anywhere on the floor, whether that's the 3-point line, mid-range, post up, at the rim, in transition, in the half court, wherever you want, KD can score and score efficiently. He's one of the most dangerous transition weapons ever, and he doesn't get enough respect for that. I guess it's because he's such a good shooter, but his ability to just fill lanes in transition and get to the rim in 2 strides, it's Giannis-esque, if I'm being honest, in terms of what he can do in transition. It's a bit more finesse, but still Giannis-esque in terms of stride length and agility. And speed coast to coast, and then the shooting ability. Sometimes I convince myself that Kevin Durant is the second best shooter of all time. That's how good of a shooter I think he is, especially when you factor in mid-range as part of shooting, and then you got the versatility of fadeaways and off the bounce and all of those things. I think I could make a very compelling argument that he is the second best shooter of all time. Now, am I willing to die on that hill? No, I don't even know if I believe it. I just think I can make the case. But I do think he's one of the 10 best shooters ever, easily. And then defensively, like you guys said, the ability to be that help side rim protector. The Warriors go into their small ball lineup where Draymond was the center, but Kevin Durant was their primary shot blocker. His ability to rotate down, be on time, use his length to alter shots was extremely valuable. And then he was able to facilitate out of his gravity. I know the big argument is, oh, Steph was the best player because they game plans for Steph and they didn't game plan for KD. A, I don't agree with that. And B, I think even when they did try and slow down Kevin Durant, he was just able to make the right read. I think what the difference was is the amount of spacing that Warriors team had. And that's where it becomes unfair, because in OKC, when he drew that amount of attention, they're helping off of Andre Roberson. In Golden State, it's Klay Thompson, it's Steph Curry, it's elite shooters at every angle, or guys who can make elite decisions offensively. So I don't know if Kevin Durant really became a better playmaker or if he just had better guys to actually get the ball to. So that's where my hesitation is with his peak. But I do think KD and Steph are closer in terms of who was the best player on those Warriors teams than I think people like to say nowadays. I think it's because Steph did ultimately win in 2022. So I think what's happened is people have gone back and said it was never close between them, when I don't agree with that, if I'm being honest. And I think Kevin Durant is, I'm a practitioner of, he's a foot on the line away from doing what Steph did without him before Steph did it. And I'm very curious about how the conversation would have shifted if KD won in 21 and then Steph won in 22. Very curious to see how they both would have discussed.
Been peak conversation. Oh.
But I am very high on Kevin Durant. Now, all of you, well, other than Logan, but Logan has said this because he hates Kevin Durant. You guys have Kevin Durant ahead of Kobe. And I don't know if I can get that far. I don't know if I can jump off that cliff with you. I don't even know if it's a cliff. I don't know if I could jump off that step with you guys. I don't know if I could do that. I still do think Kobe's scoring resiliency in the playoffs is more valuable to me. I still think he was a better passer. I think he was a better playmaker. And although I think Kevin Durant, when he was that rim protecting presence, you can make an argument that he was a better defender than peak Kobe was, and not peak defensive Kobe, peak overall Kobe in terms of that defensive impact. I think you could have that conversation, but I do think Kobe was the more valuable offensive player. I think his strength, his ability to not get knocked off his spots, and then overall, I think he was just a better tough shot maker than Kevin Durant was. So ultimately, I do think I would lean Kobe in that conversation, but I do think it's closer than some people would want to give credit for. But I do think I would slightly lean Kobe in that regard. But we are now down to everyone's final spot, which is I apologize for holding you guys here for so long. I hope you guys have enjoyed it.
No, it's been great. No, it's been a blast. This is
I told these guys an hour and a half, and we're approaching 3 hours. So yeah, I do apologize. I do apologize for this, but I am having fun.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun.
We're used to old-fashioned Yap Fest anyway, man.
Oh, dude, and this is literally the one thing in the world I would love to talk about all day, more than anything. So we're having a great time.
We're all having fun. I hope the viewers are having fun too. We have about 200 people in here watching live. So shout out to you guys for watching. We are down to our final spots. We have 2 10 spots. What a surprise, between Carson and John D. And then Logan has his 9th spot available. So I'm gonna start with Logan. Logan, who do you have at your 9th spot in between Kobe and Kevin Durant?
I feel like I'm about to get tomatoes thrown at me. Marz, I might need you on backup duty here.
I agree with.
I've got Steve Nash in my 9th spot, and I just respect what Steve Nash could do as your number one offensively. And this is maybe it is shade at Kevin. Maybe my Kevin Durant bias is showing here, but because when we look at like two-way ability too, I think there's a gap there, right? But I just think you have to respect what Steve Nash did for offense at his peak. He's giving you 18, 4, and 11 a night in the regular season on 50, 40, 90 splits with over 60% true shooting. In the playoffs, he scaled to 24 and 11 on those exact same splits. And at his apex, he's the MVP of the league. He trots out 2 number 1 offenses and another number 2 offense, right? They were just the best offenses in the league. And the one thing that I think gets held against Steve routinely is the fact that he never got a championship, right? And I think it's a little bit unfairly held against him for a few reasons. One, I think Steve Nash has some of the worst playoff luck of all time. When you look at those individual playoff runs with injuries, with suspensions, with just bad circumstances. And also, it's the most competitive I think the West has ever been. Every year, you're running into the Dallas Mavericks with Dirk. You're running into the Lakers with Kobe. You're running into the juggernaut that was the San Antonio Spurs, right? I'm sure there's some teams that I'm missing here. As my number one, Steve Nash is going to make me a great offense. He can stretch the hell out of the floor. He's one of the greatest passers of all time, a great decision maker. And I think it's underrated Steve Nash's ability to get downhill and get to the cup. Like, he's just crafty, right? I know that everybody uses that word, but he's one of them old school guys that is just going to, know how to manipulate you and get downhill. The one thing that I think I would give the edge to KD offensively over him is you guys are talking about the ease of shots. KD's athletic traits and his just physicals. He can shoot over the top of anybody. He can get to the rim at will, right, at his athletic peak. But I think Steve's a better offensive engine, and that's the reason that I've got him above him. And I leave Kawhi off. Kawhi's one of the best players I've ever seen, dude, in that single season. I can't even – that playoff run with Toronto, Kawhi just didn't miss. And Kawhi was the best defender on planet Earth. And I'm not going to act like he wasn't, but it's really brief. And I think some things had to break Kawhi's way for him to climb the mountain, right? Golden State was tattered by the time they got to the finals. And I don't want to hold that against him, but I think Steve gets unfairly criticized for not having a championship. And I think he's one of the all-time offensive engines of the 2000s. And I'd rather have him as my offensive number one than a KD or a Kawhi. So I got a feeling I am going to be a part of a large minority here, but I'm going to put some respect on Steve, and I'm going to put him at number 9.
I feel like you went a bit against your two-way philosophy, but
well, like I said,
tad,
there's certain guys that I will make an exception for, and Jokic and Steph are one of those guys, and I consider Steve Nash to be one of those guys.
I feel like I don't have to ask, but Carson and John, do you guys have Steve Nash in your top 10?
I do not. I love Steve Nash, but I just think the two-way gap versus a Kawhi or a KD, who are both such great offensive players. And I'd take Nash definitely as an offensive player over Kawhi. I think I'd take Nash over both of them. I mean, he led 7 number 1 offenses in 9 years. Like, Marz, you mentioned the stat about Steph leading the league in true shooting. Steve Nash is the only other guard to ever do that in NBA history. I mean, he was offense perfected in transition in the half court. He's the best pick and roll operator we've ever seen. One of the best shooters, one of the best passers. It's just too big a two-way gap, man. When we're talking about big, impactful wings versus a small, flat-out liability. And I'll defend his playoff resume, too. The Suns were amazing playoff offenses. He was amazing in the playoffs offensively. It's just a different level with Kawhi and KD in terms of two-way.
Do you view Steve Nash as that tier 1? I know you said Jokic is the greatest offensive player.
Yeah.
Do you view Steve Nash in that tier 1 with the Jokic, Magic Johnson, Steph?
I view him as a tier 2. Because I do think there is an ability to directly impose oneself as a scorer that even Magic has an edge on Nash with. I think Magic is underrated in how dominant he was out of the post attacking mismatches, out of pick and roll at his size. And he also was able to score with some more volume in some of those playoff settings. But I would have Nash, in that tier 2. I think he's in a tier with Oscar. If you're looking at point guards specifically who are unbelievable offensive engines, those would be the 2 guys who I have after my absolute top tier.
Interesting. Okay. And John, did you have Steve Nash?
No, I didn't. I have Kawhi. And
John.
Yeah. Before you guys, because you guys are in cahoots on something. I don't know what this is. This is disgusting.
This is actually awesome.
So before you speak on Kawhi, I want to speak on Steve Nash. I am surprised to hear that Steve Nash was in the top 10, but I love it. Steve Nash is one of my favorite.
Yeah, Steve Nash is great.
So I've made a living of defending Steve Nash. I think that's one of my strongest takes in terms of how good I think Steve Nash is offensively. I do think he's probably in that tier 1. Personally, I think from 05 to 2010, I do think he led 6 straight plus 5.5 relative offenses, that's an elite trajectory. If I remember correctly, I think James Harden's been a part of 1 plus 5.5 offense, and it was 2018. So we're talking about elite of the elite offenses, and that 2018 Houston team was the number 1 offense in the NBA. So that's the level of offense that Steve Nash was churning out year after year. So I think that's important. And I do think the playoff shortcomings does get overblown in terms of how it's Steve Nash's fault. When from 2005 to 2010, the Suns had a plus 10.5 offense with Steve Nash on the floor in the postseason. Like, the offense was never the problem. Like, it was never the problem with Steve Nash. The only year you could argue was 2008 against the Spurs, where their offense wasn't great, but I think the Spurs just caused matchup problems for them in general. I remember 05, for example, Sean Marion had the worst series of his life and they lost in 5 games. but I think Steve Nash overall played pretty well. 2007 is the year I think they should have won the championship. I think that's the best Steve Nash ever was. I think that's the best the Suns ever were. And then certain situations happened that led to them losing. So when I talk about peak Steve Nash, I'm probably talking 05 to 07 in terms of a 3-year stretch. I do think he could level up as a scorer to he's not Steph Curry, he's not Kevin Durant, he's not Kobe. But I do think if teams played him as a playmaker, he could punish them with scoring. He was an extremely efficient isolation scorer. I think he was close to leading the league in isolation efficiency, I'm pretty sure. Was one of the best, the best pick and roll player I think ever.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a hot take. His ability to shoot, pull up mid-range jumpers, the amount of shots that I want to say, I think like 10% of Steve Nash shots are unassisted, were assisted. 90% unassisted. Steve Nash is creating his own offense. He's creating offense for everyone else. And I've never seen someone make as many high leverage passes as Steve Nash. The pure shot quality he created for everyone is a big reason why the Suns were as good of an offense as they were. I think he and Magic Johnson are the two best passers in NBA history. And if I'm being honest, I think Jokic is the only one who's in that conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think, no disrespect to Jason Kidd, no disrespect to LeBron, no disrespect to Chris Paul. I think they're in tier 2. I think they're in the next Larry Bird. I think they're in the next group of passers. I think that top 3 is solidified. Me personally, I'm going Magic, Nash, Jokic. In the pure half court, I'd probably go Jokic, Nash, Magic, probably in the half court. I think that's extremely valuable. So being one of the best playmakers, one of the most efficient scorers, being able to scale that volume up. I know every Nash fan, their go-to is that 2005 series against Dallas, where Steve Nash was an elite scorer, where they actually dared him to score.
Almost dropped a 50 piece in that series, man.
He was absolutely amazing in that series as an offensive weapon. He was, I think, by far the best player in that series. They beat the Dallas Mavericks and ultimately lost to the Spurs. But I think Steve Nash as an offensive engine, I think he's in that top 6 personally. So I think you can make the case that he is in this top 10 peaks, but he's so bad defensively.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, I don't think his issues weren't effort related. Like he tried, he competed, he was aware. The issue was he was just too small and he wasn't strong enough. So he was a consistent mismatch and he didn't have the lateral quickness to stay with guards either. So he couldn't guard his matchup. So he would guard the weakest offensive players. There were occasions where he would get lost off ball, where he would get caught ball watching as well. So ultimately, there was no real positives to Steve Nash. He would put his body on the line and draw some charges. But everything else was negative for Steve Nash defensively. And I think you're at a point where if you're that good offensively, you like the baseline level of defensive impact, I think you have to provide me a Steph Curry. At least be Steph Curry level impactful. Get in passing lanes, be a defensive playmaker. Be strong enough to where you aren't constantly mismatch hunted or be able to avoid being mismatch hunted by playing within the scheme. You have to be that level of defender before I start drastically holding it against you. And unfortunately, Steve Nash wasn't. So I think top 10 might be a bit of a stretch, but I do think I could see a world in which I got him at 10, but it would be hard to make the case over Kawhi. With that being said, I'm going to give John D and Carson the floor to make the case for Kawhi. I'm going to start with John D just so we can't copy Carson. So go ahead.
Okay. The two-way ability of Kawhi Leonard was extremely impressive. And then when we talk about offensively, just being a dominant mid-range scorer and a dominant post scorer, having the strength and the technique and the footwork to be a really good offensive player in those peak years. I think I had Kawhi's peak year from 2018 to 2021. You could have thrown, like you said earlier, you could have thrown that season where before he got hurt, you could have put that in the peak as well. But I just decided to go with the stretch after. He had the amazing Toronto Raptors run where he looked great on defense. He was dominant on offense, whether it was the pull-up mid-range shooting. Throughout these years of his peak, he maintained at least 40% on catch-and-shoot jump shots, whether it's 2-point inside the arc or 3-point shots as well. The two-way ability, the strength, the post, the scoring, it all really gave me the confidence to play him top 10.
When are you saying Kawhi's peak was?
2018 to 21.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I would have 19 to 21. I think that you get a more dominant defensive version if you're going all the way back to the 15-16 season, right? I would say that that's his defensive peak, but I just think he was a significantly better offensive player at this stage. And to me, if we're talking Kawhi's peak, it has to include the 2019 season because that's the best he ever was. And if we were just going single season peak, I would probably have that version of Kawhi a couple spots higher. And we've talked about this. I might take that version of Kawhi. In fact, I think I would take that version of Kawhi over absolute peak Kevin Durant because of the level that he was still at defensively. Not his absolute peak, but one of the 5 best defensive players on the planet at that point. Then once you get to the Clippers years, he's still a very good defensive player, but he's not the same game-breaking force on that end. But if you look at the offensive production in the postseason, those years, 2019 to 2021, he's 39, 4.5. He was a better playmaker, especially in those Clippers years, on 63% true shooting. And to me is just like the epitome of a scorer whose game scales to the postseason. Because there's a few traits that I look for if you're going to be a playoff riser. Number one is strength. The ability to impose yourself physically and get to your spots. Kawhi is a machine there. Number two, dudes who are not sped up, dudes who play at their own pace. Kawhi, again, is a machine there. And specifically the ability to dominate the short intermediate area, right? Kawhi and Jokic are kind of the epitome of this in recent years. If you can't get all the way downhill, but you can still bully your way to 10 feet out, can you be automatic from that range? And Kawhi was from the entire mid-range. And then on top of that, one of the absolute best three-point shooters on the planet. So with his size, with his shooting ability, with his strength, with his pace that he played at, just an absolute scoring assassin, one of the best pure scorers we've seen. Not the level playmaker of most of these guys, even though he was better at this stage in his career. And versus a KD, where I would give KD the edge is with his off-ball value, with his ability to move away from the ball too. I think that Kawhi has played a very ISO-heavy style as a scorer, but he's just been unbelievably dominant and efficient in doing so. So I do think he has to be in my top 10. I considered some other guys. I considered AD. I think that bubble AD, 2020 AD, absolute two-way monster. But I guess actually we're not counting single season peaks. So I think there was a big difference between that version of AD and 2019 or 2021 AD. So he doesn't really qualify for that. I considered Chris Paul. I considered Dirk Nowitzki. Those were sort of the honorable mentions, but I do think Kawhi is on a different level. I think Kawhi is in those KD, Kobe conversations when he was at his best. He was that sort of monster wing.
The one thing I want to add about Kawhi is whatever peak you're taking of Kawhi, you're getting a guy who's going to miss some time. Like if it's in the regular season, if it's in the playoffs, Kawhi is going to miss 20 games. I think that's an issue that you don't have with anybody else on this list. The last guy I want to bring up, Marz, I don't want to cut you short if you have anything on Kawhi, but did you guys consider Chris Paul at all for this list? And is he top 20? Is he top 25?
Oh, sure.
Where do you think Chris Paul lands?
I think I can make an argument for top 15.
Yeah.
I think I can make an argument for top 15.
Would you guys have him over like Nash, Harden? Like where does he fall amongst the primary ball handlers?
You think he's better than Steve Nash?
I think
he's value?
Yeah, because of the defensive value. I mean, I think he's the second purest pick and roll operator we've ever seen. He was an automatic elite offensive floor raiser, and then also a really high-end defensive guard at his best, where Nash was just flat out bad. I mean, Nash is a better offensive player, but CP3 is an all-time offensive player and a really good defensive guard.
How much does point guard defense move the needle for you? Because for me, I mean, maybe you're higher on Chris Paul's offense than I am. I don't know, but because I said he's tier 1 offensive player. So for me, I'm speaking from my point of view as me viewing Steve Nash as a tier 1 offensive player.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how much elite guard defense, especially point guard defense, 6-foot point guard defense, makes up that gap in what I would view the difference between a tier 1 offensive player and Chris Paul tier 3 to me. Probably I wouldn't put him in tier 2. So like I don't know how much defense would make up for that gap for me. But if you're tier 2 Steve Nash, maybe I could see the case.
I mean, I think that is probably where it falls. I do think that Nash is the better offensive player, but although I think that that's clear, and I don't think that's really arguable, I also think that CP3 is one of the great offensive guards we've ever seen. And year after year, I mean, the on-off stuff, it's again in that like top tier of dudes. And he's another guy who scaled really well to the playoffs, consistently got better in the playoffs, despite the narrative hilariously. But like his production and efficiency both go up. That is an extreme rarity throughout NBA history to have those both go up in the postseason. And just had masterful control of the game, was unbelievable from the mid-range, unbelievable from floater range. So yeah, it's not the biggest deal in the world, right? When we're talking about point guard defense, but it's enough. And the gap is big between the two of them. I wouldn't even go as far as to say that CP3 was elite. I would say he was a very good defensive guard. And I would say Nash was a bad defensive guard.
You can
so
say
that
egregious.
The gap.
You can use any
egregious. Yeah, it was bad. Very, very bad.
Would you have CP above Dwyane Wade?
Peak to peak, no. All time, we actually did this last year, and I believe I had CP3 one spot higher, but that's a longevity thing. Peak to peak, I'll take D Wade's ability to just will his way to the rim physically. And I do think he was a more impactful defender, actually.
Another guy who I saw people mentioning in the chat too was Dirk, and I have an immense amount of respect for Dirk. The only reason I didn't have him on this list, because he let out some all-time great offenses too, with Steve Nash and then post Steve Nash. It's just his playoff drops. I mean, Dirk is obviously cemented for the 2011 run, which I think is an all-timer. But when Dirk was at his apex, winning MVPs and leading out these great offenses, he routinely did drop in the playoffs, and obviously has that loss in the first round to the We Believe Warriors, which is kind of a massive stain on his resume and is kind of what keeps him off this list. But he's a good honorable mention, I think, too.
Yeah, I think some of the playoff dropper stuff is a little overstated with Dirk. I mean, he was bad in the 2006 finals, and he was bad in the 2007 series. So that's fair. Those are two.
I mean, and that's his technical peak. Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think Dirk peaks in 06. I think he peaks later, to be honest. But
2011 is tough because 2011 is the best postseason of his career, but wasn't quite the same regular season. When do you think his peak was, Marz?
I think 07 is part of his peak, and that's the worst of his playoff blunders. But I think 07 to 09, 2010 would probably be the best Dirk was. I think he got stronger. I think his post game became more refined. I think that's when he really mastered the one-legged fadeaway, the iconic shot. And I think he was able to take advantage of teams putting wings on him in a way that he wasn't able to before. I think 07 was the last year where teams could put wings on him. Look at the Warriors series and get away with it. I think from that moment onwards, I think he got stronger. He was able to abuse those matchups, and that's where he became this unstoppable force. And I think it's reflected in his playoff scoring. I think from 08 to 2011, he was an unstoppable playoff scorer. Now, Dallas didn't have great success from 08 to 2010, but he himself was an elite playoff scorer, and I think that's because of the improvements he made. Although I think he was more athletic, more explosive the earlier years, but I think the jump shot got better, and then the strength. And similar to what Carson said about what you look at for playoff scoring, it is the strength, it is the ability to play at your own pace and then control that intermediate range. That's where Dirk mastered all of those aspects. So I think that's why that's his peak. But back to the Kawhi thing. Am I wrong for saying I think 21 Kawhi is better than 2019? Because
definitely better offensively. I would take.
I guess I'm just not as high on 2019 Kawhi's defense as you guys. Then I guess I don't know the top 5 defenders in 2019, but off the top of my head, I'm comfortable saying Rudy Gobert was a better defender. I'm comfortable saying Draymond Green was a better defender.
Yep.
I think Joel Embiid was a better defender.
Okay, I'm going to disagree there.
And then I think
you would have Giannis, AD.
Yeah, 2019
the guys
Giannis.
in the conversation.
Giannis and AD would probably be my last two. I think Joel was just such a monstrous drop defender, and his pure rim protection was probably more valuable than I think Kawhi's consistent. I think Kawhi's consistent motor on defense in 2019 just wasn't that high. If I'm being honest, so I think that's probably what turned me off a bit to his defensive. I think when he's fully engaged, he's a top 5 level defender in 2019. But I just think that engagement was just more sporadic than those guys I mentioned. And Joel Embiid
he was pretty engaged in that playoff run. He was pretty engaged. I mean, especially compared to the next 2 years. And I don't know, man. I mean, Embiid, it's the same story as ever, right? Great drop defender, but slow-footed, struggles to get back in transition, struggles to guard in space. Like, I get it. If you're going to say, okay, regular season, who's going to anchor a better defense? Sure, it'll be Embiid by the nature of positional value. But who do I want as a centerpiece of my playoff defense or as a cog in the machine, like a Toronto defense, which was a very complete group? I would take Kawhi 10 times out of 10. He just has way fewer flaws.
Was Kawhi the most valuable Raptors defender in that 19 postseason run? Because I think it was Marc Gasol. So
yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I think I lean Kawhi.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but
I guess that's where the disconnect is then. No, less a disconnect, but I guess that's where I'm picking 21 Kawhi. I think the playmaking gap was astronomical. I think he became a clear good playmaker in 2021. Whereas in 2019, I think he was a bit tunnel visioned. Elite scorer for all the reasons you mentioned. I'm never going to question Kawhi's scoring. But I guess I just valued the overall offense in 21. But I think we got through it. I think we got through our top 10. I'm gonna read off what I have here. If I've got them wrong, then whoops. But actually, let me put it on the screen. There we go. Let me be a good host. If it's wrong, then I'm being a bad host, but we'll hope it's right. I believe these are the lists. With Carson, we have LeBron, Shaq, Jokic, Duncan, Steph, Giannis, Kevin Durant, Kevin Garnett, Kobe, and Kawhi. With John, we have the same list, but I guess LeBron, Shaq, Jokic, Duncan, Steph, KD, Kobe, Giannis, KG, Kawhi. And then Logan has the most unique list with LeBron, Shaq, Duncan, KG, Jokic, Steph, Giannis, Kobe, Nash, KD. So the only player to not make everyone's list would be Nash and Kawhi, I believe. Everyone else had pretty much the same names. So I guess it's not that. I guess there's pretty much only 11 guys who are in the running, apparently, according to us up here. We did give some shout outs to some honorable mentions. I would like the chat to say who they think had the best top 10, because I'm toxic like that. But before we get out of here, we do have some more super chats. Drink more water with an interesting question. He said, great convos with different perspectives. Thank you. Which years do you consider their peaks, and who peaked higher between Dwight Howard and Russell Westbrook?
This is an awesome question. I mean, I'm going to say Dwight just because I think Russ is Russ is maybe the most polarizing and controversial player when we talk about like value. And the one thing I'll cut Russ some slack with that 2017 run, because everybody points to, the triple doubles, the gaudy numbers, all that. I wish we could have seen Russell Westbrook with a 5-out offensive-oriented basketball team that just had shooting surrounding him. I think that was really bad spacing, and they didn't maximize him. But I also think Dwight is one of the most underrated guys at his peak ever. I mean, he was a dominant force in the late 2000s, and I want to say the NBA left him off the All-75 team, which I think is incredibly disrespectful. Dwight was a monster. There was no answer for him until he got injured and went to LA. I mean, the best interior rim protector, the best defender on the planet, one hell of a rim runner, the best rebounder in the game. Like, the fact that he took that Magic team to the NBA Finals, I think, is really, really impressive. And I think he's underrated all time. I know what Russell Westbrook is. I know what he does in the playoffs. He takes a lot of shots. He misses a lot of shots. He turns the ball over a lot. He makes bad decisions. I think Russ tends to get overrated because of that MVP season. But like I said at the top, I don't think that was the most conducive offensive environment to maximizing his skill set.
I'd take Dwight easy. And I think it's 2009 to 2011 would be his peak for me. You're just looking at a guy who's going to make you, I think they had 5 or 6 straight top 6 defenses, one of the greatest rim protectors, one of the greatest defensive anchors we've seen. And when you are that level of dominant defensive player, if you can give me 20 and 12 offensively with good efficiency, and Dwight wasn't ever the most skilled post scorer, but he was an awesome lob threat rim finisher and a solid post player, that's just more impactful. I don't think you ever could have built a contending team around Russ as your best player. I just think that there were too many issues in terms of catastrophic decision-making, catastrophic shot selection, brutal inefficiency, brutal lapses in defensive focus. To me, it was much, much easier to build a contending team around Dwight in the late 2000s than it was to build a contending team around Russ as your best player ever.
When I look at these two players, because I saw this earlier and I was like, who provides more value in their respective positions? And I think I would have to go Dwight if I look at it in that sense. I think Dwight was the rim protector and the defensive player to always anchor a top defense in the league, where Russ, it's really hard to build around him offensively with the questionable shot making and the efficiency and what you value as a point guard. I think the triple doubles are great and all, but how valuable are those if you're not providing or you're not bringing value to a top offense, or you're not providing a lot of wins in the NBA as well, where Dwight Howard is consistently anchoring a defense in his peak that's top 5 in the league, and they're winning games as well. So I would take Dwight Howard.
I'm not as high on Dwight as I guess you guys, but I'm also not that high on Russ. I don't know. I think Dwight is probably the better peak, but I'm lower on Dwight overall as a player. For reference, do you guys think Dwight is better than Anthony Davis?
No.
No, I'd
No,
probably have
okay,
AD.
thank God.
No, I'm not too high on Dwight. I want to be
Yeah,
clear. I think
out of the two.
offensively, not an offensive number one. And those Orlando teams had some underrated offensive skill around him, right? Hedo was awesome. Rashard Lewis was awesome. Jameer Nelson was probably underrated, and just a very good offensive system in place. But I just think it's almost impossible to build a contending team around peak Russ as your best player. I just think there's too many fatal flaws there. And Dwight, right, because of what he could do for you defensively, it was easier. But I think AD's just a completely different level of offensive skill. And honestly, I would prefer his defensive impact slightly to peak Dwight.
Yeah, I think AD is better on both ends. I think Dwight is probably the easier player to build around because of the defense, like you alluded to. Now, I think that defense came with issues.
Yeah, he was extremely aggressive.
He was chasing blocks he had no business trying to get. The amount of goaltends he committed was ridiculous. Foul problems. But overall, just being that athletic, being that strong, he was the best rim protector in the sport.
Yeah,
I want to say
he was.
I didn't want to miss anyone like I did with Dikembe earlier. So, the best rim protector in the sport. As a rim runner, someone who can play above the rim, lob threat. Would have liked to see him involved more in pick and roll and less post ups, because every Dwight post up made my eyes bleed. An objectively bad passer, just an egregious playmaker. I pointed it out maybe a couple months ago. 2011 versus the Hawks, 3 assists to 33 turnovers in a series. That's if anyone that wants to take some time, just what is bad. So offensively, I don't even know if you can be your second best offensive player, if I'm being honest. He's more Clint Capella than anything to me offensively. So do I think I can build with a really good defensive Clint Capella versus Russell Westbrook? I don't know. I think Russell Westbrook gets maligned a little bit for his fit next to KD, when really and truly, I think those two could have worked. I think the issues came with the ancillary pieces around them. I think KD, Russ, and Serge was a great building block, and everything around it should have been better. So I don't really hold that against Russ. I think you could have won with Russ as a number 2. Now, as a number 1, whole different ball game, but I'm not sure you would have won with Dwight Howard as your best player either, unless you had really good offensive pieces. So I guess it's closer for me just because of that. I think they both have to be your second best player. It just depends on how they get it done. But if Russ's best player is Kevin Durant, it's kind of a different level. So I don't know. But as long as we all agree Anthony Davis is better than both of them, I'm fine with that. For sure. I've been contaminated by PC where I'm hearing that Dwight Howard's better than Anthony Davis, and it hurts my brain sometimes. So it's good to know that we're on the same page with that. Teddy Hart again. He's sponsored the show today. He said KD is why Bron doesn't have 5 or 6 rings. I think Houston win in 2018 regardless, if I'm being honest. 2017, I mean, it depends on where KD goes, if we're being honest. The landscape of the NBA was different, but I think Cleveland were probably the best team. Maybe the Spurs.
What about the Spurs?
Yeah, maybe the Spurs. Maybe
if he goes to the Spurs, it makes it tougher. But if he goes to any other place, because he was linked to Miami, Boston, Washington.
Yeah.
I don't think those teams would have beat the Cavs in
John Wall, Bradley Beal, and Kevin Durant.
I still don't think they beat.
It's not a bad team.
It's not. Don't get me wrong. That's definitely an Eastern Conference Finals opponent. But
going from Russell Westbrook to worse Russell Westbrook. But other than that,
but I think the 2017 Spurs would have beaten the 2017 Cavs if Kawhi stayed healthy. Of course. They were kicking the Warriors' ass for a half. Which obviously is a half of basketball.
That Cavs defense was concerning, to say the least.
It was,
to say the least.
Yeah,
and that Spurs defense was unreal.
Yeah. And now
it would have.
And that Kawhi was a monster.
Yeah.
I mean, that would have been a close series, but I think 2017 and 2018 both, and definitely 2018. I mean, it's amazing LeBron got that Cavs team to the finals. They were not going to win against Houston if they got them, and they were healthy.
Yeah,
Apparently, James Harden would have
Come here,
folded so
Kevin
badly
Love.
they would have won. But
That would have been something to behold.
if that series did happen and the Rockets lost and James Harden played terribly, even I wouldn't be able to defend James Harden. I would have to give up that mission.
They would have had Tristan Thompson and Kevin Love out in space every.
Yeah, I mean, but Kevin Love stopped Steph Curry in isolation.
He did once.
Hey, that one time was enough. But Fin275, we got 3 more super chats, and then I can stop wasting these guys' time. Oh, 4 more super chats. Sasha came in. Do you guys think KD became a better playmaker after Golden State? I think he saw defenses better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably say he's a better. Maybe.
I think a little bit.
I think Brooklyn was probably like the best playmaking version of KD.
We also just saw him with the ball in his
Mm-hmm.
hands, running more pick and roll than he was in Golden State. But I think Brooklyn, right, like 2022, I think is probably his best playmaking season. It's not a big difference, but I think slightly he got better.
Yeah, I would say it's a marginal difference. Not enough for me to convince myself that it was peak KD. But a marginal difference. Kevo 2 times says, "Are we gonna get one for old cats? MJ, Hakeem, Magic, and Bird." I mean, if Carson and Logan want to come back,
I mean, that's what I prepped for originally. So I'm actually ready to go whenever you guys are.
We were actually talking about doing that ourselves, but I'm always down. I'm down to talk peaks any era. I've got 50s takes.
Oh god! If the people want to see, if the people want to see it, I'll try and get Carson and Logan back. I've had fun with this. Hopefully it's not 3 hours again, but I've had fun with this. So yeah, I'm sure we could do that. Now I'm gonna be honest. I don't know if I'm going back to Bob Pettit, but I'll at least go back to post shot clock. Now, anything before that, I don't think I would do, but I'll at least go to the shot clock. So I'm willing to do it if the people are willing. People want to see it, we can do that. Drink More Water asks, what's the argument for Nash over CP3? That's my take, so I'll make the argument. It's clear, I'm talking peak for peak. Longevity wise, I think Chris Paul's got it. But peak for peak, I think the argument is solely just, I think once you get to a certain level of offense, like I'm not a big fan of the idea of player A is a 9 out of 10 on offense and an 8 out of 10 on defense. Player B is a 10 out of 10 on offense and a 7 on defense. So they're both 17s. I hate that ideology because I think there's exponential growth from like a 9 on offense to a 10 that isn't the same as a growth from a 6 on defense to a 7. I think once you get to that S tier, the growth of between 9 and 10 is extreme, which can't be measured just by a 1 difference. So I think Steve Nash, for me, even though I think Chris Paul is an elite offensive player, tier 3 all time, in my opinion, I think just getting to that tier 1 level, I'm putting Steve Nash in Magic Johnson territory offensively. Magic Johnson is better than Chris Paul, even though Chris Paul's the better defender. It's that same line of thinking, even though I think Magic is probably the better offensive player than Steve Nash. I'm just saying that's the line of thinking. So that would be my explanation. But then once you factor in longevity, I think Chris Paul is very clearly above Steve Nash. I think Chris Paul has put together a career that should get a lot more respect, but he hasn't because of championship success. And for some reason, he's viewed as a playoff dropper or a playoff choker, which I think is as far from the truth as humanly possible, if we're being honest. But what can you do once you build a reputation? Sasha N said, if Jokic continues shooting the 3 above 50% this season, where would you rank his peak? He can't keep getting better, can he? If he shoots above 50% from 3, then I'm not going to lie, he broke the NBA, and I'm not talking about it anymore. So I hope he doesn't do that for the sake of my content, because I will not make videos anymore. If we have a 6'11", 280-pound man being the best scorer, best playmaker, best rebounder in the sport, and now he's shooting better than any big in NBA history, I'm just not gonna continue to do that. But if he does do that, I would entertain Shaq conversations if Jokic is a legitimate 50% three-point shooter.
Entertain? Oh, you'd have to entertain them, buddy. I don't know.
Don't tell me what I have to do. No,
50% from 3.
I will sit down on Shaq's defense till the day I die. Unless Jokic is an elite defender, he can shoot 90% from 3. So no, don't tell me what I have to entertain. I'm entertaining it out of the kindness of my heart. Jokic is never going to be as good as Shaq. That's Shaq. That's the diesel. Okay, but I'm all trolling aside. I think he would be in that that group of Shaq. And I think Shaq is kind of in that group of LeBron. So by default, I think he'd be there. And then final super chat. Hunter said, Marz, we need your top 10. No, you don't. There you go. No, you don't. You got 3 top 10s. The chat has voted with an overwhelming majority of all of the lists of trash. So welcome to the toxicity of the Marz Talk Sports chat. So 64% said all the lists are trash. 14% said Carson had the best list. 12% said Logan, and then 10% said John D. But really and truly, just combine Carson and John D's list. So it's really like 23% said that they had the best list because they just copied each other. But that about does it. Oh, DR said, "Is this an NFL player?
It's a football.
Dude,
it's a
tell
football
him.
Nah, he's gonna have to earn that
Bo
respect.
Nix. So there you go. I don't know who that is, so we're not respecting him. But there we go. Now that does it. I apologize for holding you guys 2 hours longer than I said I would. I hope you guys don't mind. I think it was a good show. I hope that people enjoyed it. I would love to have you guys back sometime in the near future, maybe to do the greatest peaks of the prehistoric era. That could be interesting. I would look forward to that. But I think this has been a good show. I appreciate you guys for doing this. You didn't have to do it, so thank you guys for coming on. If there's anything you want to say about where people can find you and anything else before we get out of here.
No, thank you so much for having us. This was super fun. It was great to meet both of you guys. So yeah, like we said off the top, everywhere at Nerd Sesh on TikTok, Instagram. We have a lot of trivia content there because we do love the history. We got some takes there too. We got some clips from our show, and then YouTube. You can find all of our full shows, NBA and NFL, and we do some film breakdown stuff, some video essays going more in depth with specific players and topics. So you can basically find us everywhere. You can listen to the show, the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. But thank you so much for having us, Marz. This was really fun. Very happy to do this for 3.5 hours at any time.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys were, because I didn't anticipate this happening. It's now 1:30 in the morning, so definitely gone over what I expected. But their Nerd Sesh will be, I think that you guys are tagged in the title. I think I did my job correctly. Links are also in the description. But before we get out of here, John D, where can the people find you?
You guys can find me at The Buzzer Sports on YouTube. You can find me at The Buzzer Sports on TikTok. I also do a lot of scouting for college basketball. That's something I did when I first started YouTube. That's something I'm picking back up now. You can find daily uploads from Monday through Saturday, and then Sunday you can catch me here on normal days of our podcast. I do a lot of NBA content, film breakdown. I try to do my own podcast, but it's really hard to talk for an hour and a half when it's just you. So, but you can count on daily uploads Monday through Saturday at The Buzzer Sports. And we're almost at 1,000 subs. I'm not even a year in yet. So, this, all the love I've been getting and all the support I've been getting has been fantastic. So at The Buzzer Sports.
And John's link are also in the description. So there we go. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you guys next week, back on a Sunday, I believe. I don't know what we're going to do next week. Leave comments down below of what you want us to do. Leave comments of you guys' top 10 peaks of the past 25 years. I'll read all the comments. I think John D reads all the comments. Not sure Carson and Logan will, but maybe they will. Who knows? But thank you guys for watching. Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year.